Richard Sharpe and the Siege of Gavelga, December 1803. Written by Bernard Cornwell. Read by William Gaminara. Chapter 1. Richard Sharpe wanted to be a good officer. He truly did. He wanted it above all other things. But somehow it was just too difficult. Like trying to light a tinderbox in a rain-filled wind. Either the men disliked him, or they ignored him, or they were over-familiar, and he was unsure how to cope with any of the three attitudes, while the battalion's other officers plain disapproved of him. "You can put a racing saddle on a cart-horse," Captain Urquhart had said one night in the ragged tent which passed for the officers' mess, "but that don't make the beast quick." He hadn't been talking about Sharpe, not directly, but all the other officers glanced at him. The battalion had stopped in the middle of nowhere. It was hot as hell, and no wind alleviated the sodden heat. They were surrounded by tall crops that hid everything except the sky. A cannon fired somewhere to the north, but Sharpe had no way of knowing whether it was a British gun or an enemy cannon. A dry ditch ran through the tall crops, and the men of the company sat on the ditch lip as they waited for orders. One or two lay back and slept with their mouths wide open, while Sergeant Cahoon leafed through his tattered Bible. The sergeant was short-sighted, so had to hold the book very close to his nose, from which drops of sweat fell onto the pages. Usually the sergeant read quietly, mouthing the words, and sometimes frowning when he came across a difficult name, but today he was just slowly turning the pages with a wetted finger. "Looking for inspiration, Sergeant?" Sharpe asked. "I am not, sir," Cahoon answered respectfully, but somehow managed to convey that the question was still impertinent. He dabbed a finger on his tongue and carefully turned another page. So much for that bloody conversation, Sharpe thought. Somewhere ahead, beyond the tall plants that grew higher than a man, another cannon fired. The discharge was muffled by the thick stems. A horse neighed, but Sharpe couldn't see the beast. He could see nothing through the high crops. "Are you going to read us a story, Sergeant?" Corporal McCallum asked. He spoke in English instead of Gaelic, which meant that he wanted Sharpe to hear. "I am not, John, I am not." "Go on, Sergeant," McCallum said. "Read us one of those dirty tales about tits." The men laughed, glancing at Sharpe to see if he was offended. One of the sleeping men jerked awake and looked about him, startled, then muttered a curse, slapped at a fly, and lay back. The other soldiers of the company dangled their boots towards the ditch's crazed mudbed that was decorated with a filigree of dried green scum. A dead lizard lay in one of the dry fissures. Sharpe wondered how the carrion birds had missed it. "The laughter of fools, John McCallum," Sergeant Cahoon said, "is like the crackling of thorns under the pot." "Away with you, Sergeant," McCallum said. "I heard it in the kirk once when I was a wee kid, all about a woman whose tits were like bunches of grapes." McCallum twisted to look at Sharpe. "Have you ever seen tits like grapes, Mr. Sharpe?" "Corporal," Sharpe said. The men laughed again. McCallum scowled. Sergeant Cahoon lowered his Bible and peered at the corporal. "The Song of Solomon, John McCallum," Cahoon said, "likens a woman's bosom to clusters of grapes, and I have no doubt it refers to the garments that modest women wore in the Holy Land. Perhaps their bodices possessed balls of knotted wool as decoration. I cannot say it is a matter for your merriment." Another cannon fired, and this time a round shot whipped through the tall plants close to the ditch. The stems twitched violently, discharging a cloud of dust and small birds into the cloudless sky. The birds flew about in panic for a few seconds, then returned to the swaying seed heads. "I knew a woman who had lumpy tits," Private Hollister said. He was a dark-jawed, violent man who spoke rarely. "Lumpy like a coal sack they were." He frowned at the memory, then shook his head. "She died." "This conversation is not seemly," Cahoon said quietly, and the men shrugged and fell silent. Sharpe wanted to ask the sergeant about the clusters of grapes, but he knew such an inquiry would only cause ribaldry among the men, and, as an officer, Sharpe couldn't risk being made to look a fool. All the same, it sounded odd to him. Why would anyone say a woman had tits like a bunch of grapes? Grapes made him think of grape shot, and he wondered if the bastards up ahead were equipped with canister. Well, of course they were. but there was no point in wasting canister on a field of bulrushes. Were they bulrushes? It seemed a strange thing for a farmer to grow, but India was full of oddities. There were naked sods who claimed to be holy men, snake charmers who whistled up hooded horrors, dancing bears draped in tinkling bells, and contortionists draped in bugger-all, a right bloody circus. And the clowns ahead would have canister. They'd wait till they saw the redcoats, then load up the tin cans that burst like duckshot from the gun barrels. For what we are about to receive among the bulrushes, Sharpe thought, may the Lord make us truly thankful. "I've found it," Colquhoun said gravely. "Found what?" Sharpe asked. "I was fairly sure in my mind, sir, that the good book mentioned millet, and so it does. Ezekiel, the 4th chapter and the 9th verse." The sergeant held the book close to his eyes, squinting at the text. He had a round face, afflicted with wens, like a suet pudding studded with currants. "Take thou also unto thee wheat and barley," he read laboriously, "and beans, and lentils, and millet, and fitches, and put them in one vessel, and make thee bread thereof." Colquhoun carefully closed his Bible, wrapped it in a scrap of tarred canvas, and stowed it in his pouch. "It pleases me, sir," he explained, "if I can find everyday things in the Scriptures. I like to see things, sir, and imagine my Lord and Saviour seeing the self-same things." "But why millet?" Sharpe asked. "These crops, sir," Colquhoun said, pointing to the tall stems that surrounded them, "are millet. The natives call it jowari, but our name is millet." He cuffed the sweat from his face with his sleeve. The red dye of his coat had faded to a dull purple. "This, of course," he went on, "is pearl millet, but I doubt the Scriptures mention pearl millet, not specifically." "Millet, eh?" Sharpe said. So the tall plants were not bulrushes after all. They looked like bulrushes, except they were taller, 9 or 10 feet high. "Must be a bastard to harvest," he said, but got no response. Sergeant Colquhoun always tried to ignore swear words. "What are fitches?" McCallum asked. "A crop grown in the Holy Land," Colquhoun answered. He plainly didn't know. "Sounds like a disease, Sergeant," McCallum said. "A bad dose of the fitches leads to a cause of mercury." One or two men sniggered at the reference to syphilis, but Colquhoun ignored the levity. "Do you grow millet in Scotland?" Sharpe asked the sergeant. "Not that I'm aware of, sir," Colquhoun said ponderously, after reflecting on the question for a few seconds. "Though I dare say it might be found in the lowlands. They grow strange things there. English things." He turned pointedly away. And sod you too, Sharpe thought. And where the hell was Captain Urquhart? Where the hell was anybody, for that matter? The battalion had marched long before dawn, and at midday they'd expected to make camp. But then came a rumour that the enemy was waiting ahead, and so General Sir Arthur Wellesley had ordered the baggage to be piled and the advance to continue. The 74th had plunged into the millet. Then, 10 minutes later, the battalion was ordered to halt beside the dry ditch, while Captain Urquhart rode ahead to speak with the battalion commander, and Sharpe had been left to sweat and wait with the company, where he had damn all to do except sweat. Damn all. It was a good company, and it didn't need Sharpe. Urquhart ran it well. Colquhoun was a magnificent sergeant. The men were as content as soldiers ever were, and the last thing the company needed was a brand-new officer, an Englishman at that, who just 2 months before had been a sergeant. The men were talking in Gaelic, and Sharpe, as ever, wondered if they were discussing him. Probably not. Most likely they were talking about the dancing girls in Ferdapur, where there'd been no mere clusters of grapes, but bloody great naked melons. It had been some sort of festival, and the battalion had marched one way, and the half-naked girls had writhed in the opposite direction, and Sergeant Colquhoun had blushed as scarlet as an unfaded coat, and shouted at the men to keep their eyes front, which had been a pointless order, when a score of undressed BBs were bobbling down the highway with silver bells tied to their wrists, and even the officers were staring at them like starving men seeing a plate of roast beef. And if the men weren't discussing women, they were probably grumbling about all the marching they'd done in the last weeks, criss-crossing the Maratha countryside under a blazing sun, without a sight or smell of the enemy. Or whatever they were talking about, They were making damn sure that Ensign Richard Sharpe was left out. Which was fair enough, Sharpe reckoned. He'd marched in the ranks long enough to know that you did not talk to officers, not unless you were spoken to, or unless you were a slick-bellied, crawling bastard looking for favours. Officers were different, except Sharpe didn't feel different. He just felt excluded. I should have stayed a sergeant, he thought. He had increasingly thought that in the last few weeks, wishing he was back in the Seringapatam armoury with Major Stokes. That had been the life. And Simone Joubert, the Frenchwoman who'd clung to Sharpe after the battle at Assaye, had gone back to Seringapatam to wait for him. Better to be there as a sergeant, he reckoned, than here as an unwanted officer. No guns had fired for a while. Perhaps the enemy had packed up and gone. Perhaps they'd hitched their painted cannon to their ox teams, stowed the canister in its limbers, and buggered off northwards. In which case it would be a quick about-turn, back to the village where the baggage was stored, then another awkward evening in the officers' mess. Lieutenant Cahill would watch Sharpe like a hawk, adding twopence to Sharpe's mess bill for every glass of wine, and Sharpe, as the junior officer, would have to propose the loyal toast, and pretend not to see when half the bastards wafted their mugs over their canteens. King over the water. Toasting a dead Stuart pretender to the throne who had died in Roman exile. Jacobites who pretended George III was not the proper king. Not that any of them were truly disloyal, and the secret gesture of passing the wine over the water was not even a real secret, but rather was intended to goad Sharpe into English indignation. Except Sharpe didn't give a fig. Old King Cole could have been King of Britain for all Sharpe cared. Cahoon suddenly barked orders in Gaelic, and the men picked up their muskets, jumped into the irrigation ditch where they formed into 4 ranks, and began trudging northwards. Sharpe, taken by surprise, meekly followed. He supposed he should have asked Cahoon what was happening, but he didn't like to display ignorance. And then he saw that the rest of the battalion was also marching. So plainly Cahoon had decided No. 6 Company should advance as well. The sergeant had made no pretence of asking Sharpe for permission to move. Why should he? Even if Sharpe did give an order, the men automatically looked for Cahoon's nod before they obeyed. That was how the company worked. Urquhart commanded, Cahoon came next, and Ensign Sharpe tagged along, like one of the scruffy dogs adopted by the men. Captain Urquhart spurred his horse back down the ditch. "Well done, Sergeant," he told Cahoon, who ignored the praise. The captain turned the horse, its hooves breaking through the ditch's crust to churn up clots of dried mud. "The rascals are waiting ahead," Urquhart told Sharpe. "I thought they might have gone," Sharpe said. "They're formed and ready," Urquhart said. "Formed and ready." The captain was a fine-looking man with a stern face, straight back and steady nerve. The men trusted him. In other days, Sharpe would have been proud to serve a man like Urquhart, but the captain seemed irritated by Sharpe's presence. "I'll be wheeling to the right soon," Urquhart called to Cahoon. "Forming line on the right in 2 ranks." "Aye, sir." Urquhart glanced up at the sky. 3 hours of daylight left, he guessed. "Enough to do the job. You'll take the left files, Ensign?" "Yes, sir," Sharpe said, and knew that he'd have nothing to do there. The men understood their duty. The corporals would close the files, and Sharpe would simply walk behind them like a dog tied to a cart. There was a sudden crash of guns as a whole battery of enemy cannon opened fire. Sharpe heard the round shots whipping through the millet, but none of the missiles came near the 74th. The battalion's pipers had started playing, and the men picked up their feet and hefted their muskets in preparation for the grim work ahead. 2 more guns fired, and this time Sharpe saw a wisp of smoke above the seat heads, and he knew that a shell had gone overhead. The smoke trail from the burning fuse wavered in the windless heat as Sharpe waited for the explosion, but none sounded. "Got those fuse too long," Urquhart said. His horse was nervous, or perhaps it disliked the treacherous footing in the bottom of the ditch. Urquhart spurred the horse up the bank where it trampled the millet. "What is this stuff?" he asked Sharpe. "Maize?" "Cahoon says it's millet," Sharpe said. "Pearl millet." Urquhart grunted, then kicked his horse on towards the front of the company. Sharpe cuffed sweat from his eyes. He wore an officer's red tailcoat with the white facings of the 74th. The coat had belonged to a Lieutenant Blaine, who had died at Assaye, and Sharpe had purchased the coat for $1 in the auction of a dead officer's effects. Then he'd clumsily sewn up the bullet hole in the left breast, but no amount of scrubbing had rid the coat of Blaine's blood, which stained the faded red weave black. He wore his old trousers, the ones issued to him when he was a sergeant, red leather riding boots that he'd taken from an Arab corpse in Ahmednugger, and a tasselled red officer's sash that he'd pulled off a corpse at Assaye. For a sword, he wore a light cavalry sabre, the same weapon he'd used to save Wellesley's life at the Battle of Assaye. He didn't like the sabre much. It was clumsy, and the curved blade was never where you thought it was. You struck with the sword, and just when you thought it would bite home, you found that the blade still had 6 inches to travel. The other officers carried claymores, big, straight-bladed, heavy and lethal, and Sharpe should have equipped himself with one, but he'd balked at the auction prices. He could have bought every claymore in the auction if he'd wished, but he hadn't wanted to give the impression of being wealthy, which he was. But a man like Sharpe was not supposed to have money. He was up from the ranks, a common soldier, gutter-born and gutter-bred. But he'd hacked down a half-dozen men to save Wellesley's life, and the general had rewarded Sergeant Sharpe by making him into an officer. And Ensign Sharpe was too canny to let his new battalion know that he possessed a king's fortune. A dead king's fortune. The jewels he'd taken from the Tipu Sultan in the blood and smoke-stinking Watergate at Seringapatam. Would he be more popular if it was known he was rich? He doubted it. Wealth did not give respectability, not unless it was inherited. Besides, it was not poverty that excluded Sharpe from both the officers' mess and the ranks alike, but rather that he was a stranger. The 74th had taken a beating at Assaye. Not an officer had been left unwounded, and companies that had paraded 70 or 80 strong before the battle now had only 40 to 50 men. The battalion had been ripped through hell and back, and its survivors now clung to each other. Sharpe might have been at Assaye, he might even have distinguished himself on the battlefield, but he hadn't been through the murderous ordeal of the 74th. He was an outsider. "Line to the right!" Sergeant Cahoon shouted, and the company wheeled right and shook itself into a line of 2 ranks. The ditch had emerged from the millet to join a wide, dry riverbed, and Sharpe looked northwards to see a rill of dirty white gun smoke on the horizon. Maratha guns. But a long way away. Now that the battalion was free of the tall crops, Sharpe could just detect a small wind. It wasn't strong enough to cool the heat, but it would waft the gun smoke slowly away. "Halt!" Urquhart called. "Face front!" The enemy cannon might be far off, but it seemed that the battalion would march straight up the riverbed into the mouths of those guns. But at least the 74th was not alone. The 78th, another Highland battalion, was on their right, and on either side of those 2 Scottish battalions were long lines of Madrasi sepoys. Urquhart rode back to Sharpe. "Stevenson's joined." The captain spoke loud enough for the rest of the company to hear. Urquhart was encouraging them by letting them know that the 2 small British armies had combined. General Wellesley commanded both, but for most of the time he split his forces into 2 parts, the smaller under Colonel Stevenson. But today the 2 small parts had combined, so that 12,000 infantry could attack together. But against how many? Sharpe couldn't see the Maratha army beyond their guns, but doubtless the bastards were there in force. "Which means the 94th's off to our left somewhere," Urquhart added loudly, and some of the men muttered their approval of the news. The 94th was another Scottish regiment, so today there were 3 Scottish battalions attacking the Marathas. 3 Scottish and 10 sepoy battalions, and most of the Scots reckoned that they could have done the job by themselves. Sharpe reckoned they could too. They may not have liked him much, but he knew they were good soldiers. Tough bastards. He sometimes tried to imagine what it must be like for the Marathas to fight against the Scots. Hell, he guessed. Absolute hell. "The thing is," Colonel McCandless had once told Sharpe, "it takes twice as much to kill a Scot as it does to finish off an Englishman." Poor McCandless. He had been finished off, shot in the dying moments of Assaye. Any of the enemy might have killed the colonel, but Sharpe had convinced himself that the traitorous Englishman, William Dodd, had fired the fatal shot. And Dodd was still free, still fighting for the Marathas, and Sharpe had sworn over McCandless's grave that he would take vengeance on the Scotsman's behalf. He'd made the oath as he'd dug the colonel's grave, getting blisters as he'd hacked into the dry soil. McCandless had been a good friend to Sharpe, and now, with the colonel deep buried, so that no bird or beast could feast on his corpse, Sharpe felt friendless in this army. "Guns!" A shout sounded behind the 74th. "Make way!" 2 batteries of 6-pounder galloper guns were being hauled up the dry riverbed to form an artillery line ahead of the infantry. The guns were called gallopers because they were light and were usually hauled by horses, but now they were all harnessed to teams of 10 oxen, so they plodded rather than galloped. The oxen had painted horns, and some had bells about their necks. The heavy guns were all back on the road somewhere, so far back that they'd probably be too late to join this day's party. The land was more open now. There were a few patches of tall millet ahead, but off to the east there were arable fields, and Sharpe watched as the guns headed for that dry grassland. The enemy was watching too, and the first round shots bounced on the grass and ricocheted over the British guns. "A few minutes before the gunners bother themselves with us, I fancy," Urquhart said, then kicked his right foot out of its stirrup and slid down beside Sharpe. "Jock!" he called a soldier. "Hold on to my horse, will you?" The soldier led the horse off to a patch of grass, and Urquhart jerked his head, inviting Sharpe to follow him out of the company's earshot. The captain seemed embarrassed, as was Sharpe, who wasn't accustomed to such intimacy with Urquhart. "Do you use a cigar, Sharpe?" the captain asked. "Sometimes, sir." "Here." Urquhart offered Sharpe a roughly rolled cigar, then struck a light in his tinderbox. He lit his own cigar first, then held the box with its flickering flame to Sharpe. "The Major tells me a new draft has arrived in Madras." "That's good, sir." "It won't restore our strength, of course, but it'll help," Urquhart said. He wasn't looking at Sharpe, but staring at the British guns that steadily advanced across the grassland. There were only a dozen of the cannon, far fewer than the Maratha guns. A shell exploded by one of the ox teams, blasting the beasts with smoke and scraps of turf, and Sharpe expected to see the guns stop as the dying beasts tangled the traces. But the oxen trudged on, miraculously unhurt by the shell's violence. "If they advance too far," Urquhart murmured, "I'll become so much scrap metal." "Are you happy here, Sharpe?" "Happy, sir." Sharpe was taken aback by the sudden question. Urquhart frowned as if he found Sharpe's response unhelpful. "Happy," he said again. "Content." "Not sure a soldier's meant to be happy, sir." "Not true, not true," Urquhart said disapprovingly. He was as tall as Sharpe. Rumour said that Urquhart was a very rich man, but the only sign of it was his uniform, which was cut very elegantly in contrast to Sharpe's shabby coat. Urquhart rarely smiled, which made it difficult to be easy in his company. Sharpe wondered why the captain had sought this conversation, which seemed untypical of the unbending Urquhart. Perhaps he was nervous about the imminent battle. It seemed unlikely to Sharpe, after Urquhart had endured the cauldron of fire at Assaye, but he could think of no other explanation. "A fellow should be content in his work," Urquhart said with a flourish of his cigar. "And if he ain't, that's probably a sign that he's in the wrong line of business." "Don't have much work to do, sir," Sharpe said, wishing he didn't sound so surly. "Don't suppose you do," Urquhart said slowly. "I do see your meaning. Indeed I do." He shuffled his feet in the dust. "Company runs itself, I suppose. Cahoon's a good fellow, and Sergeant Craig's showing well, don't you think?" "Yes, sir." Sharpe knew he didn't need to call Urquhart sir all the time, but old habits died hard. "They're both good Calvinists, you see," Urquhart said. "Makes them trustworthy." "Yes, sir," Sharpe said. He wasn't exactly sure what a Calvinist was, but he wasn't going to ask. Maybe it was the same as a Freemason, and there were plenty of those in the 74th's mess, though Sharpe again didn't really know what they were. He just knew he was not one of them. "Thing is, Sharpe," Urquhart went on, though he didn't look at Sharpe as he spoke, "you're sitting on a fortune, if you follow me." "A fortune, sir?" Sharpe asked with some alarm. Had Urquhart somehow smelt out Sharpe's hoard of emeralds, rubies, diamonds, and sapphires? "You're an ensign," Urquhart explained, "and if you ain't happy, you can always sell your commission. Plenty of fine fellows in Scotland who'll pay you for the rank, even some fellows here. I gather the Scotch Brigade has some gentleman rankers." So Urquhart was not nervous about the coming fight, but rather about Sharpe's reaction to this conversation. The captain wanted to be rid of Sharpe, and the realization made Sharpe even more awkward. He wanted to be made an officer so badly, and already he wished he'd never dreamt of the promotion. What had he expected? To be slapped on the back and welcomed like a long-lost brother? To be given a company of troops? Urquhart was watching him expectantly, waiting for a response, but Sharpe said nothing. £400, Sharpe, Urquhart said. That's the official rate for an ensign's commission, but between you and me, you can squeeze at least another 50, maybe even 100, and in guineas. But if you do sell to a ranker here, then make damn sure his note is good. Sharpe said nothing. Were there really gentlemen rankers in the 94th? Such men could afford to be officers, and had an officer's breeding, but until a commission was vacant, they served in the ranks, yet ate in the mess. They were neither fish nor fowl, like Sharpe himself, and any one of them would snap at the chance to buy a commission in the 74th. But Sharpe hardly needed the money. He possessed a fortune already, and if he wanted to leave the army, then all he needed to do was resign his commission and walk away. Walk away a rich man. Of course, Urquhart went on, oblivious of Sharpe's thoughts, if the note's written on a decent army agent, then you won't have any worries. Most of our fellows use John Borry in Edinburgh, so if you see one of his notes, then you can place full trust in it. Borry's an honest fellow. Another Calvinist, you see. And a Freemason, sir? Sharpe asked. He wasn't really sure why he asked, but the question just got blurted out. He supposed he wanted to know if it was the same thing as a Calvinist. I really couldn't say. Urquhart frowned at Sharpe, and his voice became colder. The point is, Sharpe, he's trustworthy. 450 guineas, Sharpe thought. It was not to be spat on. It was another small fortune to add to his jewels, and he felt the temptation to accept Urquhart's advice. He was never going to be welcome in the 74th, and with his plunder he could set himself up in England. Coins on the barrel-head, Urquhart said. Think on it, Sharpe. Think on it. Jock, my horse! Sharpe threw away the cigar. His mouth was dry with dust, and the smoke was harsh. But as Urquhart mounted his horse, he saw the scarcely smoked cigar lying on the ground, and gave Sharpe an unfriendly look. For a second, it seemed as if the captain might say something. Then he pulled on the reins and spurred away. Bugger it, Sharpe thought. Can't do a thing right these days. The Maratha cannon had got the range of the British Galloper guns now, and one of their round shot landed plumb on a carriage. One wheel splintered, tipping the 6-pounder gun onto its side. The gunners leapt off the limber, but before they could detach the spare wheel, the ox team bolted. They dragged the broken gun back towards the sepoys, leaving a vast plume of dust where the axle boss dragged through the dry soil. The gunners ran to head the oxen off, but then a second team panicked. The beasts had their painted horns down and were galloping away from the bombardment. The Maratha guns were firing fast now. A round shot slashed into another gun team, spurting oxblood bright into the sky. The enemy guns were big brutes, and with a much longer range than the small British 6-pounders. A pair of shells exploded behind the panicked oxen, driving them even faster towards the sepoy battalions on the right of Wellesley's line. The limbers were bouncing frantically on the uneven ground, and every lurch sent shot tumbling or powder spilling. Saw General Wellesley turn his horse towards the sepoys. He was doubtless shouting at them to open ranks, and so allow the bolting oxen to pass through the line. But instead, quite suddenly, the men themselves turned and ran. "Jesus!" Sharpe said aloud, earning himself a reproving look from Sergeant Cahoon. 2 battalions of the sepoys were fleeing. Sharpe saw the general riding among the fugitives, and he imagined Wellesley shouting at the frightened men to stop and reform. But instead they kept running towards the millet. They had been panicked by the oxen, and by the weight of enemy shot that beat the dry grassland with dust and smoke. The men vanished in the high stalks, leaving nothing behind but a scatter of embarrassed officers, and, astonishingly, the 2 panicked gun teams, which had inexplicably stopped short of the millet, and now waited patiently for the gunners to catch them. "Sit yourselves down!" Urquhart called to his men, and the company squatted in the dry riverbed. One man took a stump of clay pipe from his pouch and lit it with a tinderbox. The tobacco smoke drifted slowly in the small wind. A few men drank from their canteens, but most were hoarding their water against the dryness that would come when they bit into their cartridges. Sharpe glanced behind, hoping to see the Puckalees who brought the battalion water, but there was no sign of them. When he turned back to the north, he saw that some enemy cavalry had appeared on the crest, their tall lances making a spiky thicket against the sky. Doubtless the enemy horsemen were tempted to attack the broken British line, and so stampede more of the nervous sepoys. But a squadron of British cavalry emerged from a wood, with their sabres drawn, to threaten the flank of the enemy horsemen. Neither side charged, but instead they just watched each other. The 74th's pipers had ceased their playing. The remaining British galloper guns were deploying now, facing up the long, gentle slope to where the enemy cannon lined the horizon. "Are all the muskets loaded?" Urquhart asked Colquhoun. "They'd better be, sir, or I'll want to know why." Urquhart dismounted. He had a dozen full canteens of water tied to his saddle, and he unstrung 6 of them and gave them to the company. "Shout it out," he ordered, and Sharpe wished he'd thought to bring some extra water himself. One man cupped some water in his hands and let his dog lap it up. The dog then sat and scratched its fleas, while its master lay back and tipped his shako over his eyes. What the enemy should do, Sharpe thought, is throw their infantry forward, all of it, send a massive attack across the skyline and down towards the millet, flood the riverbed with a horde of screaming warriors who could add to the panic and so snatch victory. But the skyline stayed empty except for the guns and the stalled enemy lancers. And so the redcoats waited. Colonel William Dodd, commanding officer of Dodd's Cobras, spurred his horse to the skyline, from where he stared down the slope to see the British force in disarray. It looked to him as though 2 or more battalions had fled in panic, leaving a gaping hole on the right of the redcoat line. He turned his horse and kicked it to where the Maratha warlord waited under his banners. Dodd forced his horse through the aids until he reached Prince Manu Bapu. "Throw everything forward, Sahib," he advised Bapu. "Now!" Manu Bapu showed no sign of having heard Dodd. The Maratha commander was a tall and lean man with a long, scarred face and a short black beard. He wore yellow robes, had a silver helmet with a long horsetail plume, and carried a drawn sword that he claimed to have taken in single combat from a British cavalry officer. Dodd doubted the claim, for the sword was of no pattern that he recognized, but he wasn't willing to challenge Bapu directly on the matter. Bapu was not like most of the Maratha leaders that Dodd knew. Bapu might be a prince and the younger brother of the cowardly Rajah of Berar, but he was also a fighter. "Attack now!" Dodd insisted. Much earlier in the day he'd advised against fighting the British at all, but now it seemed that his advice had been wrong, for the British assault had dissolved in panic long before it reached musket range. "Attack with everything we've got, Sahib!" Dodd urged Bapu. "If I throw everything forward, Colonel Dodd," Bapu said in his oddly sibilant voice, "then my guns will have to cease fire. Let the British walk into the cannon fire, then we shall release the infantry." Bapu had lost his front teeth to a lance thrust and hissed his words, so that to Dodd he sounded like a snake. He even looked reptilian. Maybe it was his hooded eyes, or perhaps it was just his air of silent menace. But at least he could fight. Bapu's brother, the Rajah of Berar, had fled before the battle at Assaye, but Bapu, who had not been present at Assaye, was no coward. Indeed, he could bite like a serpent. "The British walked into the cannon fire at Assaye," Dodd growled, "and there were fewer of them, and we had more guns, but still they won." Bapu patted his horse, which had shied away from the sound of a nearby cannon. It was a big, black Arab stallion, and its saddle was encrusted with silver. Both horse and saddle had been gifts from an Arabian sheikh, whose tribesmen sailed to India to serve in Bapu's own regiment. They were mercenaries from the pitiless desert, who called themselves the Lions of Allah, and they were reckoned to be the most savage regiment in all of India. The Lions of Allah were arrayed behind Bapu, a phalanx of dark-faced, white-robed warriors, armed with muskets and long, curved scimitars. "You truly think we should fight them in front of our guns?" Bapu asked Dodd. "Muskets will kill more of them than cannon will," Dodd said. One of the things he liked about Bapu was that the man was willing to listen to advice. "Meet them halfway, Sahib, thin the bastards out with musket fire, then pull back to let the guns finish them with canister. Better still, Sahib, put the guns on the flank to rake them." "Too late to do that," Bapu said. "Ah, well, maybe," Dodd sniffed. Why the Indians stubbornly insisted on putting guns in front of infantry he didn't know. Daft idea it was, but they would do it. He kept telling them to put their cannon between the regiments so that the gunners could slant their fire across the face of the infantry. But Indian commanders reckoned that the sight of guns directly in front heartened their men. "But put some infantry out front, Sahib," he urged. Bapu thought about Dodd's proposal. He didn't much like the Englishman. He was a tall, ungainly and sullen man, with long yellow teeth and a sarcastic manner. But Bapu suspected his advice was good. The prince had never fought the British before, but he was aware that they were somehow different from the other enemies he had slaughtered on a score of battlefields across western India. There was, he understood, a stolid indifference to death in those red ranks that let them march calmly into the fiercest cannonade. He hadn't seen it happen, but he'd heard about it from enough men to credit the reports. Even so, he found it hard to abandon the tried and tested methods of battle. It would seem unnatural to advance his infantry in front of the guns, and so render the artillery useless. He had 38 cannon, all of them heavier than anything the British had yet deployed, and his gunners were as well trained as any in the world. 38 heavy cannon could make a fine slaughter of advancing infantry. Yet if what Dodd said was true, then the red-coated ranks would stoically endure the punishment and keep coming. Except some had already run, which suggested they were nervous. So perhaps this was the day when the gods would finally turn against the British. "I saw 2 eagles this morning," Bapu told Dodd, "outlined against the sun." So bloody what, Dodd thought. The Indians were great ones for auguries, forever staring into pots of oil or consulting holy men, or worrying about the errant fall of a trembling leaf. But there was no better augury for victory than the sight of an enemy running away before they even reached the fight. "I assume the eagles mean victory?" Dodd asked politely. "They do," Bapu agreed. And the augury suggested the victory would be his whatever tactics he used, which inclined him against trying anything new. Besides, though Prince Manu Bapu had never fought the British, nor had the British ever faced the Lions of Allah in battle, and the numbers were in Bapu's favour. He was barring the British advance with 40,000 men, while the redcoats were not even a third of that number. "We shall wait," Bapu decided, "and let the enemy get closer." He would crush them with cannon fire first, then with musketry. "Perhaps I shall release the Lions of Allah when the British are closer, Colonel," he said to pacify Dodd. "One regiment won't do it," Dodd said. "Not even your Arab Sahib. Throw every man forward, the whole line." "Maybe," Bapu said vaguely, though he had no intention of advancing all his infantry in front of the precious guns. He had no need to. The vision of eagles had persuaded him that he would see victory, and he believed the gunners would make that victory. He imagined dead red-coated bodies among the crops. He would avenge Assaye and prove the redcoats could die like any other enemy. "Do your men, Colonel Dodd," he said sternly. Dodd wheeled his horse and spurred towards the right of the line where his cobras waited in 4 ranks. It was a fine regiment, splendidly trained, which Dodd had extricated from the siege of Ahmednagar, and then from the panic chaos of the defeat at Assaye. 2 disasters, yet Dodd's men had never flinched. The regiment had been a part of Scindia's army, but after Assaye the Cobras had retreated with the Rajah of Berat's infantry, and Prince Manu Bapu, summoned from the north country to take command of Berat's shattered forces, had persuaded Dodd to change his allegiance from Scindia to the Rajah of Berat. Dodd would have changed allegiance anyway, for the dispirited Scindia was seeking to make peace with the British. Bapu had added the inducement of gold, silver, and a promotion to colonel. Dodd's men, mercenaries all, didn't care which master they served, so long as his purse was deep. Gopal, Dodd's second-in-command, greeted the colonel's return with a rueful look. "He won't advance?" "He wants the guns to do the work." Gopal heard the doubt in Dodd's voice. "And they won't?" "They didn't at Assaye," Dodd said sourly. "Damn it! Shouldn't be fighting them here at all. Never give redcoats open ground. They should be making the bastards climb walls or cross rivers." Dodd was nervous of defeat, and he had cause to be, for the British had put a price on his head. That price was now 700 guineas, nearly 6,000 rupees, and all of it promised in gold to whoever delivered William Dodd's body, dead or alive, to the East India Company. Dodd had been a lieutenant in the company's army, but he'd encouraged his men to murder a goldsmith, and, faced with prosecution, Dodd had deserted and taken over 100 sepoys with him. That had been enough to put a price on his head, but the price rose after Dodd and his treacherous sepoys murdered the company's garrison at Casargaon. Now Dodd's body was worth a fortune, and William Dodd understood greed well enough to be fearful. If Bapu's army collapsed today, as the Maratha army had disintegrated at Assaye, then Dodd would be a fugitive on an open plain dominated by enemy cavalry. "We should fight them in the hills," he said grimly. "Then we should fight them at Gavilga," Gopal said. "Gavilga?" Dodd asked. "It is the greatest of all the Maratha fortresses, Sahib. Not all the armies of Europe could take Gavilga." Gopal saw that Dodd was sceptical of the claim. "Not all the armies of the world could take it, Sahib," he added earnestly. "It stands on cliffs that touch the sky, and from its walls men are reduced to the size of lice." "There's a way in, though," Dodd said. "There's always a way in." "There is, Sahib, but the way into Gavilga is across a neck of high rock that leads only to an outer fortress. A man might fight his way through those outer walls, but then he will come to a deep ravine, and find the real stronghold lies on the ravine's far side. There are more walls, more guns, a narrow path, and vast gates barring the way." Gopal sighed. "I saw it once, years ago, and prayed I would never have to fight an enemy who had taken refuge there." Dodd said nothing. He was staring down the gentle slope to where the red-coated infantry waited. Every few seconds a puff of dust showed where a round shot struck the ground. "If things go badly today," Gopal said quietly, "then we shall go to Gavilga, and there we shall be safe. The British can follow us, but they cannot reach us. They will break themselves on Gavilga's rocks, while we take our rest at the edge of the fortress's lakes. We shall be in the sky, and they will die beneath us like dogs." If Gopal was right, then not all the king's horses nor all the king's men could touch William Dodd at Gavilga. But first he had to reach the fortress, and maybe it would not even be necessary, for Prince Manu Bapu might yet beat the redcoats here. Bapu believed there was no infantry in India that could stand against his Arab mercenaries. Away on the plain, Dodd could see that the 2 battalions that had fled into the tall crops were now being brought back into the line. In a moment he knew that line would start forward again. "Tell our guns to hold their fire," he ordered Gopal. Dodd's Cobras possessed 5 small cannon of their own, designed to give the regiment close support. Dodd's guns were not in front of his white-coated men, but away on the right flank, from where they could lash a murderous slanting fire across the face of the advancing enemy. "Load with canister," he ordered, "and wait till they're close." The important thing was to win, but if fate decreed otherwise, then Dodd must live to fight again, at a place where a man could not be beaten. At Gavilga. The British line at last advanced. From east to west it stretched for 3 miles, snaking in and out of millet fields, through pasture land and across the wide, dry riverbed. The centre of the line was an array of 13 red-coated infantry battalions, 3 of them Scottish, and the rest sepoys. Regiments of cavalry advanced on the left flank and 4 on the right. Beyond the regular cavalry were 2 masses of mercenary horsemen, who had allied themselves to the British in hope of loot. Drums beat and pipes played. The colours hung above the shakos. A great swathe of crops was trodden flat as the cumbersome line marched north. The British guns opened fire, their small 6-pound missiles aimed at the Maratha guns. Those Maratha guns fired constantly. Sharpe, walking behind the left flank of No. 6 Company, watched one particular gun, which stood just beside a bright clump of flags on the enemy-held skyline. He slowly counted to 60 in his head, then counted it again, and worked out that the gun had managed 5 shots in 2 minutes. He couldn't be certain just how many guns were on the horizon, for the great cloud of powder smoke hid them. But he tried to count the muzzle flashes that appeared as momentary bright flames amidst the grey-white vapour, and, as best he could guess, he reckoned there were nearly 40 cannon there. 40 times 5 was, what, 200? So 100 shots a minute were being fired, and each shot, if properly aimed, might kill 2 men, one in the front rank and one behind. Once the attack was close, of course, the bastards would switch to canister, and then every shot could pluck a dozen men out of the line. But for now, as the redcoats silently trudged forward, the enemy was sending round shot down the gentle slope. A good many of these missed. Some screamed overhead, and a few bounced over the line, but the enemy gunners were good, and they were lowering their cannon barrels so that the round shot struck the ground well ahead of the redcoat line, and by the time the missile reached the target, it had bounced a dozen times and so struck at waist-height or below. Grazing, the gunners called it, and it took skill. If the first graze was too close to the gun, then the ball would lose its momentum and do nothing but raise jeers from the redcoats as it rolled to a harmless stop. While if the first graze was too close to the attacking line, then the ball would bounce clean over the redcoats. The skill was to skim the ball low enough to be certain of a hit, and all along the line the round shots were taking their toll. Men were plucked back with shattered hips and legs. Sharpe passed one spent cannonball that was sticky with blood and thick with flies, lying 20 paces from the man it had eviscerated. "Close up!" the sergeant shouted, and the file closers tugged men to fill the gaps. The British guns were firing into the enemy's smoke cloud, but their shots seemed to have no effect, and so the guns were ordered further forward. The ox teams were brought up, the guns were attached to the limbers, and the 6-pounders trundled on up the slope. "Like ninepins!" Ensign Venables had appeared at Sharpe's side. Roderick Venables was 16 years old and attached to No. 7 Company. He'd been the battalion's most junior officer till Sharpe joined, and Venables had taken it on himself to be a tutor to Sharpe in how officers should behave. "They're bowling us over like ninepins, eh, Richard?" Before Sharpe could reply, a half-dozen men of No. 6 Company threw themselves aside as a cannonball bounced hard and low towards them. It whipped harmlessly through the gap they'd made. The men laughed at having evaded it. Then Sergeant Cahoon ordered them back into their two ranks. "Aren't you supposed to be on the left of your company?" Sharpe asked Venables. "You're still thinking like a sergeant, Richard," Venables said. "Pig-Ears doesn't mind where I am." Pig-Ears was Captain Lomax, who had earned his nickname not because of any peculiarity about his ears, but because he had a passion for crisply fried pig-ears. Lomax was easy-going, unlike Urquhart, who liked everything done strictly according to regulations. "Besides," Venables went on, "there's damn all to do. The lads know their business." "Waste of time being an ensign," Sharpe said. "Nonsense! An ensign's merely a colonel in the making," Venables said. "Our duty, Richard, is to be decorative and stay alive long enough to be promoted. But no one expects us to be useful. Good God! A junior officer being useful! That'll be the day." Venables gave a hoot of laughter. He was a bumptious, vain youth, but one of the few officers in the 74th who offered Sharpe companionship. "Did you hear a new draft has come to Madras?" he asked. "Urquhart told me." "Fresh men, new officers? You won't be junior any more." Sharpe shook his head. "Depends on the date the new men were commissioned, doesn't it?" "I suppose it does. Quite right. And they must have sailed from Britain long before you got the jump up, eh? So you'll still be the mess baby. Bad luck, old fellow." Old fellow? Quite right, Sharpe thought. He was old, probably 10 years older than Venables, though Sharpe wasn't exactly sure, for no one had ever bothered to note down his birth date. Ensigns were youths, and Sharpe was a man. "Way!" Venables shouted in delight, and Sharpe looked up to see that a round shot had struck the edge of an irrigation canal and bounced vertically upwards in a shower of soil. "Pig-Ears says he once saw 2 cannonballs collide in mid-air," Venables said. "Well, he didn't actually see it across, but he heard it. He says they suddenly appeared in the sky, bang, then flopped down." "They'd have shattered and broken up," Sharpe said. "Not according to Pig-Ears," Venables insisted. "He says they flattened each other." A shell exploded ahead of the company, whistling scraps of iron casing overhead. No one was hurt, and the files stepped round the smoking fragments. Venables stooped and plucked up a scrap, juggling it because of the heat. "Like to have keepsakes," he explained, slipping the piece of iron into a pouch. "I'll send it home for my sisters. Why don't our guns stop and fire?" "Still too far away," Sharpe said. The advancing line still had half a mile to go, and while the 6-pounders could fire at that distance, the gunners must have decided to get really close, so that their shots could not miss. Get close. That was what Colonel McCandless had always told Sharpe. It was the secret of battle. Get close before you start slaughtering. A round shot struck a file in 7 Company. It was on its first graze, still travelling at blistering speed, and the 2 men of the file were whipped backwards in a spray of mingling blood. "Jesus!" Venables said in awe. "Jesus!" The corpses were mixed together, a jumble of splintered bones, tangled entrails, and broken weapons. A corporal, one of the file closers, stooped to extricate the men's pouches and haversacks from the scattered offal. "2 more names in the church porch," Venables remarked. "Who were they, Corporal?" "The McFadden brothers, sir." The corporal had to shout to be heard over the roar of the Mahratta guns. "Poor bastards," Venables said. "Still, there are 6 more. A fecund lady, Rosie McFadden." Sharpe wondered what fecund meant, then decided he could guess. Venables, for all his air of carelessness, was looking slightly pale, as though the sight of the churned corpses had sickened him. This was his first battle, for he had been sick with a Malabar itch during Assay, but the ensign was forever explaining that he couldn't be upset by the sight of blood, because from his earliest days he'd assisted his father, who was an Edinburgh surgeon. But now he suddenly turned aside, bent over, and vomited. Sharpe kept stolidly walking. Some of the men turned at the sound of Venables' retching. "Eyes front!" Sharpe snarled. Sergeant Cahoon gave Sharpe a resentful look. The sergeant believed that any order that didn't come from himself or from Captain Urquhart was an unnecessary order. Venables caught up with Sharpe. "Something I ate." "India does that," Sharpe said sympathetically. "Not to you." "Not yet," Sharpe said, and wished he was carrying a musket so he could touch the wooden stock for luck. Captain Urquhart sheered his horse leftwards. "Do you accompany Mr. Venables?" Venables scuttled away, and Urquhart rode back to the company's right flank without acknowledging Sharpe's presence. Major Swinton, who commanded the battalion, while Colonel Wallace had responsibility for the brigade, galloped his horse behind the ranks. The hooves thudded heavily on the dry earth. "All well?" Swinton called to Urquhart. "All well." "Good man." Swinton spurred on. The sound of the enemy guns was constant now, like thunder that didn't end, a thunder that pummeled the ears and almost drowned out the skirl of the pipers. Earth fountained where round shots struck. Sharpe, glancing to his left, could see a scatter of bodies lying in the wake of the long line. There was a village there. How the hell had he walked straight past the village without even seeing it? It wasn't much of a place, just a huddle of reed-thatched hovels with a few patchwork gardens protected by cactus-thorn hedges, but he'd still walked clean past without noticing its existence. He could see no one there. The villagers had too much sense. They would have packed their few pots and pans and buggered off as soon as the first soldier appeared near their fields. A Mahratta round-shot smacked into one of the hovels, scattering reed and dry timber, and leaving the sad roof sagging. Sharpe looked the other way and saw enemy cavalry advancing in the distance. Then he glimpsed the blue and yellow uniforms of the British 19th Dragoons trotting to meet them. The late afternoon sunlight glittered on drawn sabres. He thought he heard a trumpet call, but maybe he imagined it over the hammering of the guns. The horseman vanished behind a stand of trees. A cannonball screamed overhead. A shell exploded to his left. Then the 74th Light Company edged inwards to give an ox team room to pass back southwards. The British cannon had been dragged well ahead of the attacking line, where they'd now been turned and deployed. Gunners rammed home shot, pushed priming quills into touch holes, stood back. The sound of the guns crashed across the field, blotting the immediate view with grey-white smoke and filling the air with a nauseous stench of rotted eggs. End of Side 2. The drummers beat on, timing the long march north. For the moment, it was a battle of artillerymen, the puny British six-pounders firing into the smoke cloud where the bigger Mahratta guns pounded at the advancing redcoats. Sweat trickled down Sharpe's belly. It stung his eyes, and it dripped from his nose. Flies buzzed by his face. He pulled the sabre free and found that its handle was slippery with perspiration. It and his right hand on the hem of his red coat. He suddenly wanted to piss badly, but this wasn't the time to stop and unbutton breeches. "Hold it," he told himself. "Till the bastards are beaten." "Or piss in your pants," he told himself. because in this heat no one would know it from sweat, and it would dry quickly enough. Might smell, though. Better to wait. And if any of the men knew he'd pissed his pants, he'd never live it down. Piss pants Sharpe. A ball thumped overhead, so close that its passage rocked Sharpe's shako. A fragment of something whirred to his left. A man was on the ground vomiting blood. A dog barked as another tugged blue guts from an open belly. The beast had both paws on the corpse to give its tug purchase. A file closer kicked the dog away, but as soon as the man was gone, the dog ran back to the body. Sharpe wished he could have a good wash. He knew he was lousy, but then everyone was lousy. Even General Wellesley was probably lousy. Sharpe looked eastwards and saw the general spurring up behind the kilted 78th. Sharpe had been Wellesley's orderly at Assaye, and as a result he knew all the staff officers who rode behind the general. They'd be much friendlier than the 74th's officers, but then they hadn't been expected to treat Sharpe as an equal. Bugger it, he thought. Maybe he should take Urquhart's advice. Go home, take the cash, buy an inn, and hang the sabre over the serving hatch. Would Simone Joubert go to England with him? She might like running an inn. The buggered dream, he would call it, and he would charge army officers twice the real price for any drink. The Maratha guns suddenly went silent, at least those that were directly ahead of the 74th, and the change in the battle's noise made Sharpe peer ahead into the smoke cloud that hung over the crest just a quarter-mile away. More smoke wreathed the 74th, but that was from the British guns. The enemy gun smoke was clearing, carried northwards on the small wind, but there was nothing there to show why the guns at the centre of the Maratha line had ceased fire. Perhaps the buggers had run out of ammunition. Some hope, he thought, some bloody hope. Or perhaps they were all reloading with canister to give the approaching redcoats a Rajah's welcome. God, but he needed a piss. And so he stopped, tucked the sabre into his armpit, then fumbled with his buttons. One came away. He swore, stooped to pick it up, then stood and emptied his bladder onto the dry ground. Then Urquhart was wheeling his horse. "Must you do that now, Mr. Sharpe?" he asked irritably. "Yes, sir, 3 bladders full, sir, and damn your bloody eyes, sir." "Sorry, sir," Sharpe said instead. So maybe proper officers didn't piss. He sensed the company was laughing at him, and he ran to catch up, fiddling with his buttons. Still there was no gunfire from the Maratha centre. Why not? But then a cannon on one of the enemy flanks fired slantwise across the field, and the ball grazed right through No. 6 Company, ripping a front rank man's feet off and slashing a man behind through the knees. Another soldier was limping, his leg deeply pierced by a splinter from his neighbour's bone. Corporal McCallum, one of the file closers, tugged men into the gap, while a piper ran across to bandage the wounded men. The injured would be left where they fell until after the battle, when, if they still lived, they'd be carried to the surgeons. And if they survived the knives and saws, they'd be shipped home, good for nothing except to be a burden on the parish. Or maybe the Scots didn't have parishes. Sharpe wasn't sure, but he was certain the buggers had workhouses. Everyone had workhouses, and paupers' graveyards. Better to be buried out here in the black earth of enemy India than condemned to the charity of a workhouse. Then he saw why the guns in the centre of the Maratha line had ceased fire. The gaps between the guns were suddenly filled with men running forward. Men in long robes and headdresses. They streamed between the gaps, then joined together ahead of the guns beneath long green banners that trailed from silver-topped poles. Arabs, Sharpe thought. He'd seen some at Ahmednugger, but most of those had been dead. He remembered Sevaji, the Maratha who fought alongside Colonel McCandless, saying that the Arab mercenaries were the best of all the enemy troops. Now there was a horde of desert warriors coming straight for the 74th and their kilted neighbours. The Arabs came in a loose formation. Their guns had decorated stocks that glinted in the sunlight, while curved swords were scabbarded at their waists. They came almost jauntily, as though they had utter confidence in their ability. How many were there? 1,000? Sharpe reckoned at least 1,000. Their officers were on horseback. They didn't advance in ranks and files, but in a mass, and some, the bravest men, ran ahead as if eager to start the killing. The great robed mass was chanting a shrill war cry, while in its centre drummers were beating huge instruments that pulsed a belly-thumping beat across the field. Sharpe watched the nearest British gun load with canister. The green banners were being waved from side to side, so that the silk trail snaked over the warriors' heads. Something was written on the banners, but it was in no script that Sharpe recognized. 74th! Major Swinton called. Halt! The 78th had also halted. Island battalions, both under strength, after their losses at Assaye, were taking the full brunt of the Arab charge. The rest of the battlefield seemed to melt away. All Sharpe could see was the robed men coming so eagerly towards him. "Make ready!" Swinton called. "Make ready!" Urquhart echoed. "Make ready!" Sergeant Cahoon shouted. The men raised their muskets chest high and pulled back the heavy hammers. Sharpe pushed into the gap between No. 6 Company and its left-hand neighbour, No. 7. He wished he had a musket. The sabre felt flimsy. "Present!" Swinton called. "Present!" Cahoon echoed, and the muskets went into the men's shoulders. Heads bowed to peer down the barrels' lengths. "You'll fire low, boys," Urquhart said from behind the line. "You'll fire low. To your place, Mr. Sharpe." Bugger it, Sharpe thought. Another bloody mistake. He stepped back behind the company where he was supposed to make sure no one tried to run. The Arabs were close. Less than 100 paces to go now. Some had their swords drawn. The air, miraculously smoke-free, was filled with their blood-chilling war-cry, which was a weird, ululating sound. Not far now, not far at all. The Scotsman's muskets were angled slightly down. The kick drove the barrel upwards, and untrained troops, not ready for the heavy recoil, usually fired high. But this volley would be lethal. "Wait, boys, wait!" Pig-Ears called to No. 7 Company. Ensign Venables slashed at weeds with his claymore. He looked nervous. Urquhart had drawn a pistol. He dragged the cock back, and his horse's ears flicked back as the pistol's spring clicked. Arab faces screamed hatred. Their great drums were thumping. The redcoat line, just 2 ranks deep, looked frail in front of the savage charge. Major Swinton took a deep breath. Sharpe edged towards the gap again. Bugger it, he wanted to be in the front line where he could kill. It was too nerve-wracking behind the line. 74th! Swinton shouted. Then he paused. Men's fingers curled about their triggers. Let them get close, Swinton was thinking. Let them get close. Then kill them. Prince Manu Bapu's brother, the Rajah of Berar, was not at the village of Argam, where the Lions of Allah now charged to destroy the heart of the British attack. The Rajah did not like battle. He liked the idea of conquest. He loved to see prisoners paraded, and he craved the loot that filled his storehouses, but he had no belly for fighting. Manu Bapu had no such qualms. He was 35 years old. He'd fought since he was 15, and all he asked was the chance to go on fighting for another 20 or 40 years. He considered himself a true Maratha, a pirate, a rogue, a thief in armour, a looter, a pestilence, a successor to the generations of Marathas who dominated Western India by pouring from their hill fastnesses to terrorize the plump princedoms and luxurious kingdoms in the plains. A quick sword, a fast horse, and a wealthy victim. What more could a man want? And so Bapu had ridden deep and far to bring plunder and ransom back to the small land of Berar. But now all the Maratha lands were threatened. One British army was conquering their northern territory, and another was here in the south. It was this southern redcoat force that had broken the troops of Scindia and Berar at Assaye. And the Rajah of Berar had summoned his brother to bring his Lions of Allah to claw and kill the invader. This was not a task for horsemen, the Rajah had warned Bapu, but for infantry. It was a task for the Arabs. But Bapu knew this was a task for horsemen. His Arabs would win, of that he was sure, but they could only break the enemy on the immediate battlefield. He had thought to let the British advance right up to his cannon, then release the Arabs. But a whim, an intimation of triumph, had decided him to advance the Arabs beyond the guns. Let the Lions of Allah loose on the enemy's centre, and, when that centre was broken, the rest of the British line would scatter and run in panic. And that was when the Maratha horsemen would have their slaughter. It was already early evening, and the sun was sinking in the reddened west. But the sky was cloudless, and Bapu was anticipating the joys of a moonlit hunt across the flat Deccan plain. "We shall gallop through blood," he said aloud, then led his aides towards his army's right flank, so that he could charge past his Arabs when they had finished their fight. He would let his victorious lines of Allah pillage the enemy's camp, while he led his horsemen on a wild, victorious gallop through the moon-touched darkness. And the British would run. They would run like goats from the tiger. But the tiger was clever. He had only kept a small number of horsemen with the army, a mere 15,000, while the greater part of his cavalry had been sent southwards to raid the enemy's long supply roads. The British would flee straight into those men's sabres. Bapu trotted his horse just behind the right flank of the lines of Allah. The British guns were firing canister, and Bapu saw how the ground beside his Arabs was being flecked by the blasts of shot. And he saw the robed men fall. But he saw how the others didn't hesitate, but hurried on towards the pitifully thin line of redcoats. The Arabs were screaming defiance, the guns were hammering, and Bapu's soul soared with the music. There was nothing finer in life, he thought, than this sensation of imminent victory, that fired the mind with noble visions. He might have spared a moment's thought and wondered why the British didn't use their muskets. They were holding their fire, waiting until every shot could kill. But the prince wasn't worrying about such trifles. In his dreams he was scattering a broken army, slashing at them with his tulwar, carving a bloody path south. A fast sword, a quick horse, and a broken enemy. It was the Maratha paradise, and the Lions of Allah were opening its gates, so that this night Manu Bapu, prince, warrior, and dreamer, could ride into legend. Chapter 2. "Fire!" Swinton shouted. The two Highland regiments fired together, close to 1,000 muskets flaming to make an instant hedge of thick smoke in front of the battalions. The Arabs vanished behind the smoke as the redcoats reloaded. Men bit into the grease-coated cartridges, tugged ramrods that they whirled in the air before rattling them down into the barrels. The churning smoke began to thin, revealing small fires where the musket wadding burned in the dry grass. "Platoon, fire!" Major Swinton shouted. "From the flanks! Light company!" Captain Peters called on the left flank. "First platoon, fire! Kill them! Your mothers are watching!" Colonel Harness shouted. The colonel of the 78th was mad as a hatter and half delirious with a fever, but he'd insisted on advancing behind his kilted Highlanders. He was being carried in a palanquin, and as the platoon fire began, he struggled from the litter to join the battle, his only weapon a broken riding crop. He'd been recently bled, and a stained bandage trailed from a coat sleeve. "Give 'em a flogging, you dogs! Give 'em a flogging!" The two battalions fired in half companies now, each half company firing 2 or 3 seconds after the neighbouring platoon, so that the volleys rolled in from the outer wings of each battalion, met in the centre, and then started again at the flanks. Clockwork fire, Sharpe called it, and it was the result of hours of tedious practice. Beyond the battalion's flanks, the 6-pounders bucked back with each shot, their wheels jarring up from the turf as the canisters ripped apart at the muzzles. Wide swathes of burning grass lay under the cannon smoke. The gunners were working in shirt-sleeves, swabbing, ramming, then ducking aside as the guns pitched back again. Only the gun commanders, most of them sergeants, seemed to look at the enemy, and then only when they were checking the alignment of the cannon. The other gunners fetched shot and powder, sometimes heaved on a handspike or pushed on the wheels as the gun was relayed, then swabbed and loaded again. "Water!" a corporal shouted, holding up a bucket to show that the swabbing water was gone. "Fire low! Don't waste your powder!" Major Swinton called as he pushed his horse into the gap between the centre companies. He peered at the enemy through the smoke. Behind him, next to the 74th's twin flags, General Wellesley and his aides also stared at the Arabs beyond the smoke clouds. Colonel Wallace, the brigade commander, trotted his horse to the battalion's flank. He called something to Sharpe as he went by, but his words were lost in the welter of gunfire. Then his horse half spun as a bullet struck its haunch. Wallace steadied the beast, looked back at the wound, but the horse didn't seem badly hurt. Colonel Harness was thrashing one of the native palanquin bearers who'd been trying to push the colonel back into the curtained vehicle. One of Wellesley's aides rode back to quieten the colonel and to persuade him to go southwards. "Steady now!" Sergeant Cahoon shouted. "Aim low!" The Arab charge had been checked, but not defeated. The first volley must have hit the attackers cruelly hard, for Sharpe could see a line of blood on the turf. The bodies looked red and white, blood against robes, but behind that twitching heap the Arabs were firing back to make their own ragged cloud of musket smoke. They fired haphazardly, untrained in platoon volleys, but they reloaded swiftly, and their bullets were striking home. Sharpe heard the butcher's sound of metal hitting meat, saw men hurl backwards, saw some fall. The file closers hauled the dead out of the line and tugged the living closer together. "Close up! Close up!" The pipes played on, adding their defiant music to the noise of the guns. Private Hollister was hit in the head, and Sharpe saw a cloud of white flour drift away from the man's powdered hair as his hat fell off. Then blood soaked the whitened hair, and Hollister fell back with glassy eyes. "One platoon, fire!" Sergeant Cahoon shouted. He was so short-sighted that he could barely see the enemy, but it hardly mattered. No one could see much in the smoke, and all that was needed was a steady nerve, and Cahoon was not a man to panic. "Two platoon, fire!" Urquhart shouted. "Christ Jesus!" a man called close to Sharpe. He reeled backwards, his musket falling, then he twisted and dropped to his knees. "Oh, God! Oh, God!" he moaned, clutching at his throat. Sharpe could see no wound there, but then he saw blood seeping down the man's grey trousers. The dying man looked up at Sharpe, tears showed in his eyes, then he pitched forward. Sharpe picked up the fallen musket, then turned the man over to unstrap the cartridge box. The man was dead, or so near as to make no difference. "Flint!" a front-rank man called. "I need a flint!" Sergeant Cahoon elbowed through the ranks, holding out a spare flint. "And where's your own spare flint, John Hammond?" "Christ knows, Sergeant." "Then ask him, for you're on a charge." A man swore as a bullet tore up his left arm. He backed out of the ranks, the arm hanging useless and dripping blood. Sharpe pushed into the gap between the companies, put the musket to his shoulder and fired. The kick slammed into his shoulder, but it felt good, something to do at last. He dropped the butt, fished a cartridge from the pouch and bit off the top, tasting the salt in the gunpowder. He rammed, fired again, loaded again. A bullet made an odd fluttering noise as it went past his ear. Then another whined overhead. He waited for the rolling volley to come down the battalion's face, then fired with the other men of 6 Company's 1st Platoon. Dropped the butt, new cartridge, bite, prime, pour, ramrod back in the hoops, gun up, butt into the bruised shoulder, and haul back the doghead. Sharpe did it as efficiently as any other man, but he'd been trained to it. That was the difference, he thought grimly. He was trained. But no one trained the officers. They had bugger all to do, so why train them? Ensign Venables was right. The only duty of a junior officer was to stay alive. But Sharpe couldn't resist a fight. Besides, it felt better to stand in the ranks and fire into the enemy's smoke than stand behind the company and do nothing. The Arabs were fighting well, damn well. Sharpe couldn't remember any other enemy who had stood and taken so much concentrated platoon fire. Indeed, the robed men were trying to advance, but they were checked by the ragged heap of bodies that had been their front ranks. How many damned ranks had they? A dozen? He watched a green flag fall, then the banner was picked up and waved in the air. Their big drums still beat, making a menacing sound to match the redcoats' pipers. The Arab guns had unnaturally long barrels that spewed dirty smoke and licking tongues of flame. Another bullet whipped close enough to Sharpe to bat his face with a gust of warm air. He fired again. Then a hand seized his coat collar and dragged him violently backwards. "Your place, Ensign Sharpe," Captain Urquhart said vehemently, "is here, behind the line." The captain was mounted, and his horse had inadvertently stepped back as Urquhart seized Sharpe's collar, and the weight of the horse had made the captain's tug far more violent than he'd intended. "You're not a private any longer," he said, steadying Sharpe, who'd almost been pulled off his feet. "Of course, sir," Sharpe said, and he didn't meet Urquhart's gaze, but stared bitterly ahead. He was blushing, knowing he'd been reprimanded in front of the men. Damn it to hell, he thought. "Prepare to charge!" Major Swinton called. "Prepare to charge!" Captain Urquhart echoed, spurring his horse away from Sharpe. The Scotsmen pulled out their bayonets and twisted them onto the lugs of their musket barrels. "Up to your guns!" Swinton called. and those men who were still loaded raised their muskets and fired a last volley.
74th!
Swinton shouted.
Forward! I want to hear some pipes! Let me hear pipes!
Go on, Swinton, go on! Wallace shouted. There was no need to encourage the battalion forward, for it was going willingly, but the colonel was excited. He drew his claymore and pushed his horse into the rear rank of No. 7 Company.
"Onto them, lads! Onto them!"
The redcoats marched forward, trampling through the scatter of little fires started by their musket wadding. The Arabs seemed astonished that the redcoats were advancing. Some drew their own bayonets, while others pulled long, curved swords from scabbards.
"They won't stand!"
Wellesley shouted.
"They won't stand!"
"They bloody well will," a man grunted.
"Go on!"
Swinton shouted. "Go on!" And the 74th, released to the kill, ran the last few yards and jumped up onto the heaps of dead before slashing home with their bayonets. Off to the right, the 78th were also charging home. The British cannon gave a last violent blast of canister, then fell silent as the Scots blocked the gunners' aim. Some of the Arabs wanted to fight. Others wanted to retreat. But the charge had taken them by surprise, and the rearward ranks were still not aware of the danger, and so pressed forward, forcing the reluctant men at the front onto the Scottish bayonets. The Highlanders screamed as they killed. Sharpe still held the unloaded musket as he closed up on the rear rank. He had no bayonet, and was wondering whether he should draw his sabre, when a tall Arab suddenly hacked down a front rank man with a scimitar, then pushed forward to slash with the reddened blade at the second man in the file. Sharpe reversed the musket, swung it by the barrel, and hammered the heavy stock down onto the swordsman's head. The Arab sank down, and a bayonet struck into his spine, so that he twisted like a speared eel. Sharpe hit him on the head again, kicked him for good measure, then shoved on. Men were shouting, screaming, stabbing, spitting, and right in the face of No. 6 Company, a knot of robed men were slashing with scimitars as though they could defeat the 74th by themselves. Urquhart pushed his horse up against the rear rank and fired his pistol. One of the Arabs was plucked back, and the others stepped away at last, all except one short man, who screamed in fury and slashed with his long, curved blade. The front rank parted to let the scimitar cut the air between two files. Then the second rank also split apart to allow the short man to come screaming through on his own, with only Sharpe in front.
"He's only a lad!"
a Scottish voice shouted in warning as the ranks closed again. It was not a short man at all, but a boy. 12 or 13 years old, Sharpe guessed, as he fended off the scimitar with a musket barrel. The boy thought he could win the battle single-handed, and leapt at Sharpe, who parried the sword and stepped back to show he didn't want to fight. "Put it down, lad," he said. The boy spat, leapt and cut again. Sharpe parried a third time, then reversed the musket and slammed its stock into the side of the boy's head. For a second the lad stared at Sharpe with an astonished look. Then he crumpled to the turf.
"They're breaking!"
Wellesley shouted from somewhere close by.
"They're breaking!"
Colonel Wallace was in the front rank now, slicing down with his claymore. He hacked like a farmer, blow after blow. He had lost his cocked hat, and his bald pate gleamed in the late sunlight. There was blood on his horse's flank, and more blood spattered on the white turnbacks of his coat-tails. Then the pressure of the enemy collapsed, and the horse twisted into the gap, and Wallace spurred it on.
"Come on, boys, come on!"
A man stooped to rescue Wallace's cocked hat. Its plumes were blood-soaked. The Arabs were fleeing.
"Go!" Swinton shouted. "Go! Keep 'em running! Go!"
A man paused to search a corpse's robes, and Sergeant Cahoon dragged the man up and pushed him on. The file closers were making sure none of the enemy bodies left behind the Scottish advance were dangerous. They kicked swords and muskets out of injured men's hands, prodded apparently unwounded bodies with bayonets, and killed any man who showed a spark of fight. Two pipers were playing their ferocious music, driving the Scots up the gentle slope where the big Arab drums had been abandoned. Man after man speared the drumskins with bayonets as they passed.
"Forward on! Forward on!"
Urquhart bellowed as though he were on a hunting field.
"To the guns!"
Wellesley called.
"Keep going!"
Sharpe bellowed at some laggards.
"Go on, you bastards, go on!"
The enemy gun line was at the crest of the low rise, but the Maratha gunners dared not fire because the remnants of the Lions of Allah were between them and the redcoats. The gunners hesitated for a few seconds, then decided the day was lost, and fled.
"Take the guns!" Wellesley called.
Colonel Wallace spurred among the fleeing enemy, striking down with the claymore, then reined in beside a gaudily painted 18-pounder.
"Come on, lads! Come on, to me!"
The Scotsmen reached the guns. Most had reddened bayonets, all had sweat streaks striping their powder-blackened faces. Some began rifling the limbers where gunners stored food and valuables.
"Load!"
Urquhart called.
"Load!" "Form ranks!"
Sergeant Cahoon shouted. He ran forward and tugged men away from the limbers.
"Leave the carts alone, boys! Form ranks! Smartly now!"
End of Side 3. Up for the first time could see down the long reverse slope. 300 paces away were more infantry, a great long line of it massed in a dozen ranks, and beyond that were some walled gardens and the roofs of a village. The shadows were very long, for the sun was blazing just above the horizon. The Arabs were running towards the stationary infantry.
"Where are the galloper guns?"
Wallace roared, and an aide spurred back down the slope to fetch the gunners.
"Give them a volley, Swinton!"
Wellesley called. The range was very long for a musket, but Swinton hammered the battalion's fire down the slope, and maybe it was that volley, or perhaps it was a sight of the defeated Arabs that panicked the great mass of infantry. For a few seconds they stood under their big, bright flags, and then, like sand struck by a flood, they dissolved into a rabble. Cavalry trumpets blared. British and sepoy horsemen charged forward with sabres, while the irregular horse, those mercenaries who'd attached themselves to the British for the chance of loot, lowered their lances and raked back their spurs. It was a cavalryman's paradise, a broken enemy with nowhere to hide. Some Marathas sought shelter in the village, but most ran past it, throwing down their weapons as the terrible horsemen streamed into the fleeing horde with sabres and lances slicing and thrusting.
"Buckle these!"
Urquhart shouted, standing in his stirrups to look for the men and boys who brought water to the troops. There was none in sight, and the 74th was parched, the men's thirst made acute by the saltpetre and the gunpowder which had fouled their mouths.
"Where the—"
Urquhart swore, then frowned at Sharpe.
"Mr. Sharpe, I'll trouble you to find out Buckley's." "Yes, sir,"
Sharpe said, not bothering to hide his disappointment at the order. He'd hoped to find some loot when the 74th searched the village, but instead he was to be a fetcher of water. He threw down the musket and walked back through the groaning, slow-moving litter of dead and dying men. Dogs were scavenging among the bodies.
"Forward now!"
Wellesley called behind Sharpe, and the whole long line of British infantrymen advanced under their flags towards the village. The cavalry was already far beyond the houses, killing with abandon and driving the fugitives ever further northwards. Sharpe walked on southwards. He suspected the Puckleys were still back with the baggage, which would have been a 3-mile walk, and by the time he had found them, the battalion would have slaked its thirst from the wells in the village. Bugger it, he thought. Even when they gave him a job, it was a useless errand. A shout made him look to his right, where a score of native cavalrymen were slicing apart the robes of the dead Arabs in search of coins and trinkets. The scavengers were Marathas, who had sold their services to the British, and Sharpe guessed that the horsemen had not joined the pursuit for fear of being mistaken for the defeated enemy. One of the Arabs had only been feigning death, and now, despite being hugely outnumbered, defied his enemies with a pistol that he dragged from beneath his robe. The taunting cavalryman had made a ring, and the Arab kept twisting around to find that his tormentor had skipped away before he could aim the small gun. The Arab was a short man. Then he turned again, and Sharpe saw the bruised, bloody face, and recognized the child who had charged the 74th so bravely. The boy was doomed, for the ring of cavalrymen was slowly closing for the kill. One of the Marathas would probably die, or at least be horribly injured by the pistol ball, but that was part of the game. The boy had 1 shot. They had 20. A man prodded the boy in the back with a lance point, making him whip round. But the man with the lance had stepped fast back, and another man slapped the boy's headdress with a tulva. The other cavalryman laughed. Sharpe reckoned the boy deserved better. He was a kid, nothing more, but brave as a tiger, and so he crossed to the cavalryman. "Let him be!" he called. The boy turned towards Sharpe. If he recognized that the British officer was trying to save his life, he showed no sign of gratitude. Instead, he lifted the pistol so that its barrel pointed at Sharpe's face. The cavalryman, reckoning this was even better sport, urged him to shoot. He touched the boy with a raised tulva, but did not strike. He would let the boy shoot Sharpe, then kill him. "Let him be," Sharpe said. "Stand back!" The Marathas grinned, but did not move. Sharpe could take the single bullet, then they would tear the boy into sabre-shredded scraps of meat. The boy took a step toward Sharpe. "Don't be a bloody fool, lad," Sharpe said. The boy obviously didn't speak English, but Sharpe's tone was soothing. It made no difference. The lad's hand was shaking and he looked frightened, but defiance had been bred into his bone. He knew he'd die, but he'd taken enemy's soul with him, and so he nerved himself to die well. "Put the gun down," Sharpe said softly. He was wishing he hadn't intervened now. The kid was just distraught enough and mad enough to fire, and Sharpe knew he could do nothing about it except run away, and thus expose himself to the jeers of the Marathas. He was close enough now to see the scratches on the pistol's blackened muzzle, where the rammer had scraped the metal. "Don't be a bloody fool, boy," he said again. Still the boy pointed the pistol. Sharpe knew he should turn and run, but instead he took another pace forward. Just one more, and he reckoned he'd be close enough to swat the gun aside. Then the boy shouted something in Arabic, something about Allah, and pulled the trigger. The hammer didn't move. The boy looked startled, then pulled the trigger again. Sharpe began laughing. The expression of woe on the child's face was so sudden and so unfeigned that Sharpe could only laugh. The boy looked as if he was about to cry. The Maratha behind the boy swung his tulva. He reckoned he could slice clean through the boy's grubby headdress and decapitate him. But Sharpe had taken the extra step, and now seized the boy's hand and tugged him into his belly. The sword hissed an inch behind the boy's neck. "I said to leave him alone," Sharpe said. "Or do you want to fight me instead?" "None of us," a calm voice said behind Sharpe, "wants to fight Ensign Sharpe." Sharpe turned. One of the horsemen was still mounted, and it was this man who had spoken. He was dressed in a tattered European uniform jacket of green cloth, hung with small silver chains, and he had a lean, scarred face with a nose as hooked as Sir Arthur Wellesley's. He now grinned down at Sharpe. "Syed Savaji," Sharpe said. "I never did congratulate you on your promotion," Savaji said, and leant down to offer Sharpe his hand. Sharpe shook it. "It was McCandless's doing," he said. "No," Savaji disagreed. "It was yours." Savaji, who led this band of horsemen, waved his men away from Sharpe, then looked down at the boy who struggled in Sharpe's grip. "You really want to save that little wretch's life?" "Why not?" "A tiger cub plays like a kitten," Savaji said, "but it still grows into a tiger, and one day it eats you." "This one's no kitten," Sharpe said, thumping the boy on the ear to stop his struggles. Savaji spoke in quick Arabic, and the boy went quiet. "I told him you saved his life," Savaji explained to Sharpe, "and that he is now beholden to you." Savaji spoke to the boy again, who, after a shy look at Sharpe, answered. "His name's Ahmed," Savaji said, "and I told him you were a great English lord who commands the lives and deaths of 1,000 men." "You told him what?" "I told him you'd beat him bloody if he disobeys you," Savaji said, looking at his men, who, denied their entertainment, had gone back to looting the dead. You like being an officer?" he asked Sharpe. "I hate it." Savaji smiled, revealing red-stained teeth. "McCandless thought you would, but didn't know how to curb your ambition." Savaji slid down from his saddle. "I'm sorry McCandless died," the Indian said. "Me too." "You know who killed him?" "I reckon it was Dodd." Savaji nodded. "Me too." Syed Savaji was a high-born Maratha, the eldest son of one of the Raja of Berat's warlords, but a rival in the Raja's service had murdered his father, and Savaji had been seeking revenge ever since. If that revenge meant marching with the enemy British, then that was a small price to pay for family pride. Savaji had ridden with Colonel McCandless when the Scotsman had pursued Dodd, and thus he had met Sharpe. Benny Singh was not with the enemy today, he told Sharpe. Sharpe had to think for a few seconds before remembering that Benny Singh was the man who'd poisoned Savaji's father. How do you know? His banner wasn't among the Maratha flags. Today we faced Manu Bapu, the Raja's brother. He's a better man than the Raja, but he refuses to take the throne for himself. He's also a better soldier than the rest, but not good enough, it seems. Dodd was there. He was? He got away. Savaji turned and gazed northwards. And I know where they're going. Where? To Gavilgar, Savaji said softly. To the Sky Fort. Gavilgar? I grew up there. Savaji spoke softly, still gazing at the hazed northern horizon. My father was a Kilada of Gavilgar. It was a post of honor, Sharpe, for it's our greatest stronghold. It is the fortress in the sky, the impregnable refuge, the place that has never fallen to our enemies. And Benny Singh is now its Kilada. Somehow we shall have to get inside, you and I shall kill Singh, and you will kill Dodd. That's why I'm here, Sharpe said. No. Savaji gave Sharpe a sour glance. You're here, Ensign, because you British are greedy. He looked at the Arab boy and asked a question. There was a brief conversation, then Savaji looked at Sharpe again. I've told him he is to be your servant, and that you will beat him to death if he steals from you. I wouldn't do that, Sharpe protested. I would, Savaji said, and he believes you would, but it still won't stop him thieving from you. Better to kill him now. He grinned, then hauled himself into his saddle. I shall look for you at Gavilgar, Mr. Sharpe. I shall look for you, Sharpe said. Savaji spurred away, and Sharpe crouched to look at his new servant. Ahmed was as thin as a half-drowned cat. He wore dirty robes and a tattered headdress secured by a loop of frayed rope that was stained with blood, evidently where Sharpe's blow with a musket had caught him during the battle. But he had bright eyes and a defiant face, and though his voice hadn't yet broken, he was braver than many full-grown men. Sharpe unslung his canteen and pushed it into the boy's hand, first taking away the broken pistol that he tossed away. Drink up, you little bugger, Sharpe said, and come for a walk. The boy glanced up the hill, but his army was long gone. It had vanished into the evening beyond the crest, and was now being pursued by vengeful cavalry. He said something in Arabic, drank what remained of Sharpe's water, then offered a grudging nod of thanks. So Sharpe had a servant. A battle had been won, and now he walked south in search of Pakali's. Colonel William Dodd watched the lions of Allah break and spat with disgust. It had been foolish to fight here in the first place, and now the foolery was turning to disaster. Jamada, he called. Sahib? We'll form square, put our guns in the centre, and the baggage. Families, Sahib? Families too. Dodd watched Manu Bapu and his aides galloping back from the British advance. The gunners had already fled, which meant that the Marathas' heavy cannon would all be captured, every last piece of it. Dodd was tempted to abandon his regiment's small battery of 5-pounders, which were about as much use as pea-shooters, but a soldier's pride persuaded him to drag the guns from the field. Bapu might lose all his guns, but it would be a cold day in hell before William Dodd gave up artillery to an enemy. His Cobras were on the Maratha right flank, and there, for the moment, they were out of the way of the British advance. If the rest of the Maratha infantry remained firm and fought, then Dodd would stay with them. But he saw that the defeat of the Arabs had demoralized Bapu's army. The ranks began to dissolve. The first fugitives began to run north, and Dodd knew this army was lost. First Assaye, now this. A goddamn disaster. He turned his horse and smiled at his white-jacketed men. You haven't lost a battle, he shouted to them. You haven't even fought today, so you've lost no pride. But you'll have to fight now. If you don't, if you break ranks, you'll die. If you fight, you'll live. Jimana, march! The Cobras would now attempt one of the most difficult of all feats of soldiering, a fighting withdrawal. They marched in a loose square, the centre of which gradually filled with their women and children. Some other infantry tried to join the families, but Dodd snarled at his men to beat them away. "Don't go!" he shouted. The last thing he wanted was for his men to be infected by panic. Dodd trailed the square. He heard cavalry trumpets, and he twisted in his saddle to see a mass of irregular light horsemen come over the crest.
"Halt!" he shouted. "Close ranks! Charge bayonets!"
The white-jacketed cobras sealed the loose square tight. Dodd pushed through the face of the square and turned his horse to watch the cavalrymen approach. He doubted they'd come close, not when there were easier pickings to the east. And sure enough, as soon as the leading horsemen saw that the square was waiting with levelled muskets, they sheered away. Dodd holstered his pistol.
"March on, Jemadar!"
Twice more Dodd had to halt and form ranks, but both times the threatening horsemen were scared away by the calm discipline of his white-coated soldiers. The red-coated infantry was not pursuing. They had reached the village of Argaum and were content to stay there, leaving the pursuit to the horsemen. And those horsemen chased after the broken rabble that flooded northwards, but none chose to die by charging Dodd's formed ranks. Dodd inclined to the west, angling away from the pursuers. By nightfall he was confident enough to form the battalion into a column of companies, and by midnight, under a clear moon, he could no longer even hear the British trumpets. He knew that men would still be dying, ridden down by cavalry and pierced by lances, or slashed by sabres, but Dodd had got clean away. His men were tired, but they were safe, in a dark countryside of millet fields, drought-emptied irrigation ditches, and scattered villages where dogs barked frantically when they caught the scent of the marching column. Dodd didn't trouble the villagers. He had sufficient food, and earlier in the night they'd found an irrigation tank that had yielded enough water for men and beasts.
"Do you know where we are, Jemadar?"
he asked. "No, Sahib." Gopal grinned, his teeth showing white in the darkness.
"Nor do I, but I know where we're going."
"Where, Sahib?"
"To Gavalgir, Gopal. To Gavalgir."
"Then we must march north, Sahib." Gopal pointed to the mountains that showed as a dark line against the northern stars. "It's there, Sahib." Dodd was marching to the fortress that had never known defeat, to the impregnable fastness on the cliff, to Gavalgir. Dawn came to the millet fields. Ragged winged birds flopped down beside corpses. The smell of death was already rank, and would only grow worse as the sun rose to become a furnace in a cloudless sky. Bugles called reveille, and the pickets who guarded the sleeping army around Argaum cleared their muskets by loosing off shots. The gunfire startled birds up from corpses, and made the feasting dogs growl among the human dead. Regiments dug graves for their own dead. There were few enough to bury, for no more than 50 redcoats had died, but there were hundreds of Maratha and Arab corpses, and the Lascars who did the army's fetching and carrying began the task of gathering the bodies. Some enemies still lived, though barely, and the luckiest of those were dispatched with a blow of a mattock before their robes were rifled. The unlucky were taken to the surgeons' tents. The enemy's captured guns were inspected, and a dozen selected as suitable for British service. They were all well made, forged in Agra by French-trained gunsmiths, but some were the wrong calibre, and a few were so over-decorated with writhing gods and goddesses that no self-respecting gunner could abide them. The 26 rejected guns would be double-shotted and exploded.
"A dangerous business,"
Lieutenant Colonel William Wallace remarked to Sharpe.
"Indeed, sir." "You saw the accident at Assay?"
Wallace asked. The colonel took off his cocked hat and fanned his face. The hat's white plumes were still stained with blood that had dried black.
"I heard it, sir. Didn't see it,"
Sharpe said. The accident had occurred after the Battle of Assay, when the enemy's captured cannon were being destroyed, and one monstrous piece, a great siege gun, had exploded prematurely, killing 2 engineers.
"Leaves us short of good engineers,"
Wallace remarked.
"And we'll need them if we're going to Gavalgir."
"Gavalgir, sir?"
"A ghastly fortress, Sharpe. Quite ghastly."
The colonel turned and pointed north.
"Only about 20 miles away, and if the Marathas have any sense, that's where they'll be heading."
Wallace sighed.
"I've never seen the place, so maybe it isn't as bad as they say, but I remember poor McCandless describing it as a brute, a real brute. Like Stirling Castle, he said, only much larger, and the cliffs 20 times higher."
Seen Stirling Castle, so had no real idea what the colonel meant. He said nothing. He'd been idling the morning away when Wallace sent for him, and now he and the colonel were walking through the battle's litter. The Arab boy followed a dozen paces behind.
"Yours, is he?"
Wallace asked.
"Think so, sir. Sort of picked him up yesterday." "You need a servant, don't you? Urquhart tells me you don't have one."
So Urquhart had been discussing Sharpe with the colonel. No good could come of that, Sharpe thought. Urquhart had been nagging Sharpe to find a servant, implying that Sharpe's clothes were in need of cleaning and pressing, which they were. But as he only owned the clothes he wore, he couldn't really see the point in being too finicky.
"I hadn't really thought what to do with the lad, sir,"
Sharpe admitted. Wallace turned and spoke to the boy in an Indian language, and Ahmed stared up at the colonel and nodded solemnly, as though he understood what had been said. Perhaps he did, though Sharpe didn't.
"I've told him he's to serve you properly," Wallace said, "and that you'll pay him properly."
The colonel seemed to disapprove of Ahmed, or maybe he just disapproved of everything to do with Sharpe, though he was doing his best to be friendly. It had been Wallace who had given Sharpe the commission in the 74th, and Wallace had been a close friend of Colonel McCandless, so Sharpe supposed that the balding colonel was in his way an ally. Even so, Sharpe felt awkward in the Scotsman's company. He wondered if he would ever feel relaxed among officers.
"How's that woman of yours, Sharpe?"
Wallace asked cheerfully.
"My woman, sir?"
Sharpe asked, blushing.
"A French woman. Can't recall her name. Took quite a shine to you, didn't she?"
"Simone, sir. She's in Seringapatam, sir. Seemed the best place for her, sir."
Quite.
Simone Joubert had been widowed at Assaye, where her husband, who'd served Scindia, had died. She'd been Sharpe's lover, and after the battle she'd stayed with him. Where else, she'd asked, was she to go? But Wellesley had forbidden his officers to take their wives on the campaign, and though Simone was not Sharpe's wife, she was white, and so she'd agreed to go to Seringapatam, and there wait for him. She'd carried a letter of introduction to Major Stokes, Sharpe's friend who ran the armoury, and Sharpe had given her some of the Tipu's jewels so that she could find servants and live comfortably. He sometimes worried he'd given her too many of the precious stones, but consoled himself that Simone would keep the surplus safe till he returned.
"So, are you happy, Sharpe?"
Wallace asked bluffly. "Yes, sir," Sharpe said bleakly.
"Keeping busy?"
"Not really, sir."
"Difficult, isn't it?"
Wallace said vaguely. He'd stopped to watch the gunners loading one of the captured cannon, a great brute that looked to take a ball of 20 or more pounds. The barrel had been cast with an intricate pattern of lotus flowers and dancing girls, then painted with garish colours. The gunners had charged the gaudy barrel with a double load of powder, and now they rammed 2 cannonballs down the blackened gullet. An engineer had brought some wedges, and a gunner sergeant pushed one down the barrel, then hammered it home with the rammer, so that the ball would jam when the gun was fired. The engineer took a ball of fuse from his pocket, pushed one end into the touch-hole, then backed away, uncoiling the pale line.
"Best if we give them some space,"
Wallace said, gesturing that they should walk south a small way.
"Don't want to be beheaded by a scrap of gun, eh?"
"No, sir."
"Very difficult,"
Wallace said, picking up his previous thought.
"Coming up from the ranks. Admirable, Sharpe, admirable, but, difficult, yes?"
"I suppose so, sir," Sharpe said unhelpfully. Wallace sighed, as though he was finding the conversation unexpectedly hard-going.
"Urquhart tells me you seem—"
The colonel paused, looking for the tactful word.
"Unhappy?"
"Takes time, sir."
Of course, these things do, quite."
The colonel wiped a hand over his bald pate, then rammed his sweat-stained hat back into place.
"I remember when I joined, years ago now, of course. I was only a little chap, didn't know what was going on. They said turn left, then turned right. Damned odd, I thought. I was ass over elbow for months, I can tell you."
The colonel's voice tailed away.
"Damned hot,"
he said after a while.
"Damned hot."
"Ever heard of the 95th, Sharpe?" 95th, sir. Another Scottish regiment?"
"Lord, no. The 95th Rifles. They're a new regiment, couple of years old. Used to be called the Experimental Corps of Riflemen."
Wallace hooted with laughter at the clumsy name.
"But a friend of mine is busy with the rascals. Wally Stewart, he's called. The Honourable William Stewart. Capital fellow. But Wally's got some damned odd ideas. His fellows wear green coats. Green! And he tells me his riflemen ain't as ridges as he seems to think we are.
Wallace smiled to show he'd made some kind of joke.
Thing is, Sharpe, I wondered if you wouldn't be better suited to Stuart's outfit. His idea, you should understand. He wrote wondering if I had any bright young officers who could carry some experience of India to Shorncliffe. I was going to write back and say we do precious little skirmishing here. But it's skirmishing that Willie's rogues have been trained to do. What are I thought of you, Sharpe?
Sharpe said nothing. Whichever way you wrapped it up, he was being dismissed from the 74th, though he supposed it was kind of Wallace to make the 95th sound like an interesting sort of regiment. Sharpe guessed they were the usual shambles of a hastily raised wartime battalion, staffed by the leavings of other regiments and composed of gutter rogues discarded by every other recruiting sergeant. The very fact that they wore green coats sounded bad, as though the army could not be bothered to waste good red cloth on them. They'd probably dissolve in panic chaos in their first battle.
I've written to Willie about you, Wallace went on, and I know he'll have a place for you.
Meaning, Sharpe thought, that the Honourable William Stewart owed Wallace a favour.
And our problem, frankly, Wallace continued, is that a new draft has reached Madras. Wasn't expecting it till spring, but they're here now, so we'll be back to strength in a month or so.
Wallace paused, evidently wondering if he'd softened the blow sufficiently.
And the fact is, Sharpe, he resumed after a while, but Scottish regiments are more like, well, families. Families, that's just it. My mother always said so, and she was a pretty shrewd judge of these things. Like families. More so, I think, than English regiments, don't you think?
Yes, sir, Sharpe said, trying to hide his misery.
But I can't let you go while there's a war on, Wallace continued heartily.
The colonel had turned to watch the cannon again. The engineer had finished unwinding his fuse, and the gunners now shouted at everyone within earshot to stand away.
I do enjoy this, the colonel said warmly. Nothing like a bit of gratuitous destruction to set the juices flowing, eh?
The engineer stooped to the fuse with his tinderbox. Sharpe saw him strike the flint, then blow the charred linen into flame. There was a pause, then he put the fuse end into the small fire, and the smoke fizzed up. The fuse burned fast, the smoke and the sparks snaking through the dry grass and starting small fires. Then the red-hot trails streaked up the back of the gun and down into the touch-hole. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the whole gun just seemed to disintegrate. The charge had tried to propel the double shot up the wedged barrel, but the resistance was just big enough to restrict the explosion. The touch-hole shot out first, the shaped piece of metal tearing out a chunk of the upper breech. Then the whole rear of the painted barrel split apart in smoke, flame, and whistling lumps of jagged metal. The forward part of the barrel, jaggedly torn off, dropped to the grass as the gun's wheels were splayed out. The gunners cheered.
"One less Maratha gun?"
Wallace said. Ahmed was grinning broadly.
"Did you know Mackay?"
Wallace asked Sharpe.
"No, sir. Captain Mackay, Hugh Mackay. East India Company officer, 4th Native Cavalry. Very good fellow indeed, Sharpe. I knew his father well. Point is, though, that young Hugh was put in charge of the bullock train before Assaye, and he did a very good job. Very good. But he insisted on joining his troopers in the battle. Disobeyed orders, you see. Wellesley was adamant that Mackay must stay with his bullocks, but young Hugh wanted to be on the dance floor, and quite right too, except that the poor devil was killed, cut in half by a cannonball.
Wallace sounded shocked, as though such a thing was an outrage.
That's left the bullock train without a guiding hand, Sharpe.
Christ, Sharpe thought. But he was to be made bullock master.
Not fair to say they don't have a guiding hand, Wallace continued, because they do. But the new fellow don't have any experience with bullocks. Torrance, he's called. I'm sure he's a good fellow, but things are likely to get a bit more sprightly from now on, going deeper into enemy territory, see. And there are still lots of their damned horsemen at large. And Torrance says he needs a deputy officer, someone to help him. Thought you might be just the fellow for the job, Sharpe.
Wallace smiled as though he was granting Sharpe a huge favour.
"Don't know anything about bullocks, sir," Sharpe said doggedly. "I'm sure you don't. Who does? And there are dromedaries and elephants. A regular menagerie, eh? But the experience, Sharpe, will do you good. Think of it as another string to your bow.
Sharpe knew a further protest would do no good, so he nodded.
Yes, sir, he said. Good, good, splendid.
Wallace could not hide his relief.
It won't be for long, Sharpe. Scindia is already suing for peace, and the Rajah of Berat's bound to follow. We may not even have to fight at Gavilgar, if that's where the rogues do take refuge. So go and help Torrance. Then you can sit across for England, eh? Become a green jacket.
So Ensign Sharpe had failed. Failed utterly. He'd been an officer for 2 months, and now he was being booted out of a regiment. Sent to the bullocks and the dromedaries, whatever the hell they were. And after that to the green-coated dregs of the army. Bloody hellfire, he thought. Bloody hellfire. The British and their allied cavalry rode all night, and in the dawn they briefly rested, watered their horses, then hauled themselves into their saddles and rode again. They rode till their horses were reeling with tiredness and white with sweat, and only then did they give up the savage pursuit of the Maratha fugitives. Their sabre arms were weary, their blades blunted and their appetites slaked. The night had been a wild hunt of victory, a slaughter under the moon that had left the plain reeking with blood, and the sun brought more killing and wide-winged vultures that flapped down to the feast. The pursuit ended close to a sudden range of hills that marked the northern limit of the Deccan plain. The hills were steep and thickly wooded, no place for cavalry, and above the hills reared great cliffs, dizzyingly high cliffs, that stretched from the eastern to the western horizon like the nightmare ramparts of a tribe of giants. In places there were deep re-entrants cut into the great cliff, and some of the British pursuers, gaping at the vast wall of rock that barred their path, supposed that the wooded clefts would provide a path up to the cliff's summit, though none could see how anyone could reach the highland if an enemy chose to defend it. Between two of the deep re-entrants, a great promontory of rock jutted from the cliff face, like the prow of a monstrous stone ship. The summit of the jutting rock was 2,000 feet above the horsemen on the plain, and one of them, scrubbing blood from his sabre-blade with a handful of grass, glanced up at the high peak, and saw a tiny puff of whiteness drifting from its crest. He thought it a small cloud, but then he heard a faint bang of gunfire, and a second later a round shot dropped vertically into a nearby patch of millet. His captain pulled out a telescope and trained it high into the sky. He stared for a long time, then gave a low whistle.
"What is it, sir?" "It's a fortress," the captain said. He could just see black stone walls, shrunken by distance, poised above the grey-white rock. "The bloody sky," he said grimly. "That's what it is. It's Gavilgar." More guns fired from the fortress, but they were so high in the air that their shots lost all their forward momentum long before they reached the ground. The balls fell like nightmare rain, and the captain shouted at his men to lead their horses out of range. "Their final refuge," he said, then laughed. "Well, it's nothing to do with us, boys. The infantry will have to deal with that big bastard." The cavalrymen slowly moved southwards. Some of their horses had lost shoes, which meant they had to be walked home, but their night's work was well done. They'd ravaged a broken army, and now the infantry must cope with the Marathas' final refuge. A sergeant shouted from the right flank, and the captain turned westwards to see a column of enemy infantry appearing from a grove of trees just over a mile away. The white-coated battalion still possessed their artillery, but they showed no sign of wanting a fight. A crowd of civilians and several companies of fugitive Marathas had joined the regiment, which was heading for a road that twisted into the hills beneath the fort, then zigzagged its way up the face of the rock promontory. If that road was the only way into the fort, the cavalry captain thought, then God help the redcoats who had to attack Gavilgar. He stared at the infantry through his telescope. The white-coated troops were showing small interest in the British cavalry, but it still seemed prudent to quicken his pace southwards. A moment later, and the cavalry was hidden behind millet fields. The captain turned a last time and gazed again at the fortress on the soaring cliffs. It seemed to touch the sky, so high it stood above all India. "Bastard of a place," the captain said wonderingly, then turned and left. He had done his job, and now the infantry must climb to the clouds to do theirs. Colonel William Dodd watched the blue-coated cavalrymen walk their tired horses southwards until they vanished beyond a field of standing millet.
The subadar in charge of the regiment's small cannon had wanted to unlimber and open fire on the horsemen, but Dodd had refused his permission. There would have been no point in attacking, for by the time the guns were loaded, the cavalrymen would have walked out of range. He watched a last salvo of round shot plummet to earth from the fort's high guns. Those cannon were of little use, Dodd thought, except to overawe people on the plain. It took Dodd's regiment over 7 hours to climb to the fort of Gavilgur, and by the time he reached the summit, Dodd's lungs were burning, his muscles aching, and his uniform soaked with sweat. He'd walked every step of the way, refusing to ride his horse, for the beast was tired, and, besides, if he expected his men to walk up the long road, then he would walk it as well. He was a tall, sallow-faced man with a harsh voice and an awkward manner. But William Dodd knew how to earn his men's admiration. They saw that he walked when he could have ridden, and so they didn't complain as the steep climb sapped their breath and stole their strength. The regiment's families, its baggage, and its battery of cannon were still far below, on the twisting, treacherous track that in its last few miles was little more than a ledge hacked from the cliff. Dodd formed his cobras into 4 ranks as they approached Gavilgur's southern entrance, where the great metal-studded gates were being swung open in welcome.
"March smartly now,"
Dodd called to his men.
"You've nothing to be ashamed of. You lost no battle."
He pulled himself up into his saddle and drew his gold-hilted sword to salute the flag of Berar that flapped above the high gate tower. Then he touched his heels to the mare's flanks and led his undefeated men into the tower's long entrance tunnel. He emerged into the afternoon sun to find himself staring at a small town that was built within the stronghold's ramparts and on the summit of Gavilgur's promontory. The alleys of the town were crammed with soldiers, most of them Maratha cavalrymen, who had fled in front of the British pursuit. But, twisting in his saddle, Dodd saw some infantry of Gavilgur's garrison standing on the far step. He also saw Manu Bapu, who had outridden the British pursuit and now gestured to Dodd from the gate tower's turret. Dodd told one of his men to hold his horse, then climbed the black walls to the top far step of the tower, where he stopped in awed astonishment at the view. It was like standing at the edge of the world. The plain was so far beneath, and the southern horizon so far away, that there was nothing in front of his eyes but endless sky. This, Dodd thought, was a god's view of earth, the eagle's view. He leant over the parapet and saw his guns struggling up the narrow road. They wouldn't reach the fort till long after nightfall. "You were right, Colonel," Manu Bapu said ruefully. Dodd straightened to look at the Maratha prince. "It's dangerous to fight the British in open fields," he said. "They're here." Dodd gestured at the approach road. "Here they'll die, Sahib." "The fort's main entrance," Bapu said in his sibilant voice, "is on the other side, to the north." Dodd turned and gazed across the roof of the central palace. He could see little of the great fortress's northern defences, though a long way away he could see another tower like the one on which he now stood. "Is the main entrance as difficult to approach as this one?" he asked. "No, but it isn't easy. The enemy has to approach along a narrow strip of rock, then fight through the outer fort. After that comes a ravine, and then the inner fort. I want you to guard the inner gate." Dodd looked suspiciously at Bapu. "Not the outer fort?" Dodd reckoned his cobras should guard the place where the British would attack. That way the British would be defeated. "The outer fort is a trap," Bapu explained. He looked tired, but the defeated Agam had not destroyed his spirit, merely sharpened his appetite for revenge. "If the British capture the outer fort, they will think they have won. They won't know that an even worse barrier waits beyond the ravine. That barrier has to be held. I don't care if the outer fort falls, but we must hold the inner. That means our best troops must be there." "It will be held," Dodd said. Bapu turned and stared southwards. Somewhere in the heat-haze distance the British forces were readying to march on Gavilgur. "I thought we could stop them at Agaum," he admitted softly. Dodd, who'd advised against fighting at Agam, said nothing. "But here," Bapu went on, "they will be stopped." Here, Dodd thought, they would have to be stopped. He deserted from the East India Company's army because he faced trial and execution. but also because he believed he could make a fortune as a mercenary serving the Marathas. So far he'd endured 3 defeats, and each time he'd led his men safe out of the disaster. But from Gavilgur there would be no escape. The British would block every approach, so the British must be stopped. They must fail in this high place, and so they would, Dodd consoled himself. For nothing imaginable could take this fort. He was on the world's edge, lifted into the sky, and for the redcoats it would be like scaling the very heights of heaven. So here, at last, deep inside India, the redcoats would be beaten. 6 cavalrymen in the blue and yellow coats of the 19th Light Dragoons waited outside the house where Captain Torrance was said to be billeted. They were under the command of a long-legged sergeant who was lounging on a bench beside the door. The sergeant glanced up as Sharpe approached. "I hope you don't want anything useful out of the bastards," he said acidly, then saw that the shabby uniformed Sharpe, despite wearing a pack like any common soldier, also had a sash and a sabre. He scrambled to his feet. "Sorry, sir." Sharpe waved him back down onto the bench. "Useful?" he asked. "Horseshoes, sir. That's all we bleeding want, horseshoes. Supposed to be 4,000 in store, but can they find them?" The sergeant spat. "Tells me they're lost. I'm to go to the Binjaris and buy them. I'm supposed to tell my captain that. So now we have to sit here till Captain Torrance gets back. Maybe he knows where they are. That monkey in there," he jerked his thumb at the house's front door, "doesn't know a bloody thing." Sharpe pushed open the door to find himself in a large room where a half-dozen men argued with a harried clerk. The clerk, an Indian, sat behind a table covered with curling ledgers. "Captain Torrance is ill," the clerk snapped at Sharpe without waiting to discover the newcomer's business. "And take that dirty Arab boy outside," the clerk added, jerking his chin at Ahmed, who, armed with a musket he had taken from a corpse on the battlefield, had followed Sharpe into the house. "Muskets!" The man tried to attract the clerk's attention. "Horseshoes!" an East India Company lieutenant shouted. "Buckets!" a gunner said. "Come back tomorrow," the clerk said. "Tomorrow!" "You said that yesterday," the gunner said, "and I'm back." "Where's Captain Torrance?" Sharpe asked. "He's ill," the clerk said disapprovingly, as though Sharpe had risked the captain's fragile health even by asking the question. "He cannot be disturbed. And why is that boy here? He's an Arab." "Because I told him to be here," Sharpe said. He walked round the table and stared down at the ledgers. What a bleeding mess. "Sahib!" The clerk had now realized Sharpe was an officer. "Other side of the table, Sahib. Please, Sahib. There is a system here, Sahib. I stay this side of the table and you remain on the other. Please, Sahib." "What's your name?" Sharpe asked. The clerk seemed affronted at the question. "I am Captain Torrance's assistant," he said grandly. "And Torrance is ill?" "The captain is very sick." "So who's in charge?" "I am," the clerk said. "Not any longer," Sharpe said. He looked up at the East India Company lieutenant. "What did you want?" "Horseshoes." "So where are the bleeding horseshoes?" Sharpe asked the clerk. "I have explained, Sahib, I have explained," the clerk said. He was a middle-aged man with a lugubrious face and pudgy, ink-stained fingers that now hastily tried to close all the ledgers so that Sharpe couldn't read them. "Now, please, Sahib, join the queue." "Where are the horseshoes?" Sharpe insisted, leaning closer to the sweating clerk. "This office is closed," the clerk shouted. "Closed till tomorrow. All business will be conducted tomorrow. Captain Torrance's orders." "Ahmed," Sharpe said, "shoot the bugger." Ahmed spoke no English, but the clerk didn't know that. He held his hands out. "I am closing the office. Work cannot be done like this. I shall complain to Captain Torrance. There will be trouble. Big trouble." The clerk glanced at the door that led to the inner part of the house. "Is that where Torrance is?" Sharpe asked, gesturing at the door. "No, Sahib, and you cannot go in there. The captain is sick." Sharpe went to the door and pushed it open. The clerk yelped to protest, but Sharpe ignored him. A muslin screen hung on the other side of the door, and entangled Sharpe as he pushed into the room where a sailor's hammock hung from the beams. The room seemed empty, but then a whimper made him look into a shadowed corner. A young woman crouched there. She was dressed in a sari, but she looked European to Sharpe. She had been sewing gold braid onto the outer seams of a pair of breeches, but now stared in wide-eyed fright at the intruder. "Who are you, ma'am?" Sharpe asked. The woman shook her head. She had very black hair and very white skin. Her terror was palpable. "Is Captain Torrance here?" Sharpe asked. "No," she whispered. "Well, he's sick, is that right?" "If he says so, sir," she said softly. Her London accent confirmed that she was English. "I ain't going to hurt you, love," Sharpe said. Her fear was making her tremble. "Are you Mrs. Torrance?" "No." "So, you work for him?" "Yes, sir."
"And you don't know where he is?"
"No, sir," she said softly, looking up at Sharpe with huge eyes. She was lying, he reckoned, but he guessed she had good reason to lie, perhaps fearing Torrance's punishment if she told the truth. He considered soothing the truth out of her, but reckoned it might take too long. He wondered who she was. She was pretty, despite her terror, and he guessed she was Torrance's Bibi. Lucky Torrance, he thought ruefully.
"I'm sorry to have disturbed you, ma'am," he said.
Then he negotiated the muslin curtain back into the front room. The clerk shook his head fiercely.
"You should not have gone in there, sahib. This is private quarters. Private. I shall be forced to tell Captain Torrance."
Sharpe took hold of the clerk's chair and tipped it, forcing the man off. The men waiting in the room gave a cheer. Sharpe ignored them, sat on the chair himself, and pulled a tangle of ledgers towards him.
"I don't care what you tell Captain Torrance," he said, "so long as you tell me about the horseshoes first." "They are lost," the clerk protested. "How were they lost?"
Sharpe asked.
The clerk shrugged. "Things get lost," he said.
Sweat was pouring down his plump face as he tentatively tried to tug some of the ledgers away from Sharpe, but he recoiled from the look on the ensign's face. The clerk said again weakly,
"It's the nature of things to get lost." "Muskets?" Sharpe asked. "Lost," the clerk admitted. "Buckets?" "Lost," the clerk said. "Paperwork?" Sharpe said. The clerk frowned. "Paperwork, sahib?" "If something's lost," Sharpe said patiently, "there's a record. This is the bloody army. You can't have a piss without someone making a note of it. So, show me the records of what's been lost." The clerk sighed and pulled one of the big ledgers open. "Yes, sahib," he said, pointing an inky finger. "1 barrel of horseshoes, see? Being carried on an ox from Jamkandgi, lost in the Godavari on November the 12th. "How many horseshoes in a barrel?" Sharpe asked. 120. The long-legged cavalry sergeant had come into the office and now leaned against the doorpost. "And there are supposed to be 4,000 horseshoes in store?" Sharpe asked. "Here." The clerk turned a page. "Another barrel, see?" Sharpe peered at the ill-written entry. "Lost in the Godavari," he read aloud. "And here?" The clerk stabbed his finger again. "Stolen," Sharpe read. A drop of sweat landed on the page as the clerk turned it back. "So who stole it?" "The enemy, sahib," the clerk said. "Their horsemen are everywhere." "Their bloody horsemen run if you so much as look at them," the tall cavalry sergeant said sourly. "They couldn't steal an egg from a chicken." "The convoys are ambushed, sahib," the clerk insisted, "and things are stolen." Sharpe pushed the clerk's hand away and turned the pages back, looking for the date when the battle had been fought at Assaye. He found it, and discovered a different handwriting had been used for the previous entries. He guessed Captain Mackay must have kept the ledger himself, and in Mackay's neat entries there were far fewer annotations reading "stolen" or "lost." Mackay had marked 8 cannonballs as being lost in a river crossing, and 2 barrels of powder had been marked down as stolen. But in the weeks since Assaye, no fewer than 68 oxen had lost their burdens to either accidents or thieves. More tellingly, each of those oxen had been carrying a scarce commodity. The army wouldn't miss a load of round shot, but it would suffer grievously when its last reserve of horseshoes was gone. "Whose handwriting is this?"
Sharpe had turned to the most recent page. "Mine, Sahib." The clerk was looking frightened. "How do you know when something is stolen?" The clerk shrugged. "The captain tells me, or the sergeant tells me." "The sergeant? He isn't here," the clerk said. "He's bringing a convoy of oxen north." "What's the sergeant's name?" Sharpe asked, for he could find no record in the ledger. "Hakeswill," the cavalry sergeant said laconically. "He's the bugger we usually deal with, on account of Captain Torrance always being ill." "Bloody hell," Sharpe said, and pushed the chair back. Hakeswill. Obadiah bloody Hakeswill. "Why wasn't he sent back to his regiment?" Sharpe asked. "He isn't supposed to be here at all." "He knows the system," the clerk explained. "Captain Torrance wanted him to stay, Sahib." And no bloody wonder, Sharpe thought. Hakeswill had worked himself into the army's most profitable billet. He was milking the cow, but making sure it was the clerk's handwriting in the ledger. No flies on Obadiah. "How does the system work?" he asked the clerk. "Chitties," the clerk said. "Chitties? An ox driver is given a chitty, Sahib, and when he has delivered his load, the chitty is signed and brought here. Then he is paid. No chitty, no money. It's the rule, Sahib. No chitty, no money." "And no bloody horseshoes either," put in the lean sergeant of the 19th. "And Sergeant Hakeswill pays the money?" Sharpe asked. "If he's here, Sahib," the clerk said. "That doesn't get me my damned horseshoes," the company lieutenant protested. "Oh, my buckets," the gunner put in. "The Binjaris have all the essentials," the clerk insisted. He made shooing gestures. "Go and see the Binjaris. They have necessaries. This office is closed till tomorrow." "But where did the Binjaris get their necessaries, eh? Answer me that," Sharpe demanded, but the clerk merely shrugged. The Binjaris were merchants who travelled with the army, contributing their own vast herds of pack-oxen and carts. They sold food, liquor, women, and luxuries, and now it seemed they were offering military supplies as well, which meant that the army would be paying for things that were normally issued free. And, doubtless, if bloody Hakeswill had a finger in the pot, things which had been stolen from the army in the first place. "Where do I go for horseshoes?" Sharpe asked the clerk. The clerk was reluctant to answer, but he finally spread his hands and suggested Sharpe ask in the merchants' encampment. "Someone will tell you, Sahib." "You tell me," Sharpe said. "I don't know." "So how do you know they have horseshoes?" "I hear these things," the clerk protested. Sharpe stood and bullied the clerk back against the wall. "You do more than hear things," he said, leaning his forearm against the clerk's neck. "You know things, so you bloody well tell me, or I'll have my Arab boy chop off your goolies for his breakfast. He's a hungry little bugger." The clerk fought for breath against the pressure of Sharpe's arm. "Nig!" He offered the name plaintively when Sharpe relaxed his arm. "Naig?" Sharpe asked. The name rang a distant bell. A long-ago bell. Naig. Then he remembered a merchant of that name who'd followed the army to Seringapatam. "Naig?" Sharpe asked again. A fellow with green tents?" "The very one, Sahib," the clerk nodded. "But I didn't tell you this thing. These gentlemen are witnesses. I did not tell you." "He runs a brothel," Sharpe said, remembering. And he remembered, too, how Naig had been a friend to Sergeant Obadiah Hakeswill 4 years before. Sharpe had been a private then, and Hakeswill had trumped up charges that had fetched Sharpe a flogging. Nasty Naig had been the man's nickname, and back then he'd sold pale-skinned whores who travelled in green-curtained wagons. "Right," Sharpe said. "This office is closed." The gunner protested, and the cavalry sergeant looked disappointed. "We're going to see Naig," Sharpe announced. "No," the clerk said too loud. "No?" Sharpe asked. "He will be angry, Sahib." "Well, why should he be angry?" Sharpe demanded. "I'm a customer, ain't I? He's got horseshoes, and we want horseshoes. He should be delighted to see us." "He must be treated with respect, Sahib," the clerk said nervously. "He's a powerful man, Naig. You have money for him?" "I just want to look at his horseshoes," Sharpe said. "And if they're army issue, then I'll ram one of them down his bloody throat." The clerk shook his head. "He has guards, Sahib. He has jetties." I think I might let you go on your own," the East India Company lieutenant said, backing away. "Jetties?" the light dragoon sergeant asked. "Strong men," Sharpe explained. "Big buggers who kill you by wringing your neck like a chicken." He turned back to the clerk. "Where did Naik get his jetties? From Seringapatam?" "Yes, Sahib." "I killed enough of the buggers," Sharpe said, "so I don't mind killing a few more. You coming?" he asked the cavalry sergeant. "Why not?" The man grinned. "Anyone else?" Sharpe asked, but no one else seemed to want to fight that afternoon. "Please, Sahib," the clerk said weakly. Sharpe ignored him, and, followed by Ahmed and the cavalryman, went back into the sunlight. "What's your name?" Sharpe asked the sergeant. "Lockhart, sir. Eli Lockhart." "I'm Dick Sharpe, Eli. And you don't have to call me sir. I'm not a proper bleeding officer. I was made up at Assaye, and I wish the buggers had left me a sergeant now. They sent me to be a bloody bullock driver, because I'm not fit for anything else." He looked at Lockhart's 6 troopers who were still waiting. "What are they doing here?" "Well, didn't expect me to carry the bloody horseshoes myself, did you?" Lockhart said, then gestured at the troopers. "Come on, boys, we're going to have a scrap." "Who said anything about a scrap?" Sharpe asked. "He's got horseshoes," Lockhart explained, "but we don't have money, so there's only one way to get them off him." "True," Sharpe said, and grinned. Lockhart suddenly looked oddly shy. "Was you in the captain's quarters, sir?" "Yes, why?" The tough-looking sergeant was actually blushing now. "You didn't see a woman there, did you, sir?" "Dark-haired girl, pretty." "Right, sir." "Who is she?" "Torrance's servant, a widow. He brought her and her husband out from England, but a fellow died and left her on her own. Torrance won't let her go." "And you'd like to take her off his hands? Is that it?" "Well, I've only ever seen her at a distance," the sergeant admitted. "Torrance was in another regiment, one of the Madrasis, but we camped together often enough." "She's still there," Sharpe said dryly. "Still alive." "He keeps her close, he does," Lockhart said, then kicked a dog out of his path. The 8 men had left the village and entered the sprawling encampment where the merchants with their herds, wagons and families were camped. Great white oxen with painted horns were hobbled by pegs, and children scurried among the beasts collecting their dung, which they slapped into cakes that would be dried for fuel. "So tell me about these jetties," Lockhart asked. "Like circus strongmen," Sharpe said. "Only it's some kind of religious thing. Don't ask me. None of it makes bleeding sense to me. Got muscles like mountains they have, but they're slow. I killed 4 of the buggers at Seringapatam." "And you know Hakeswill?" "I know bloody Hakeswill. Recruited me, he did, and he's been persecuting me ever since. He shouldn't even be with this army. He's supposed to be with the Havercakes down south, but he came up here with a warrant to arrest me. That didn't work, so he's just stayed, isn't he? And he's working the bleeding system. You can wager your last shilling that he's the bastard who supplies Naig and splits the profit." Sharpe stopped to look for green tents. "How come you don't carry your own spare horseshoes?" "Oh, we do, but when they've gone you have to get more from the supplies. That's how the system's supposed to work. And yesterday's pursuit left half the hooves wrecked. We need shoes." Sharpe had seen a cluster of faded green tents. "That's where the bastard is," he said, then looked at Lockhart. "This could get nasty." Lockhart grinned. He was as tall as Sharpe and had a face that looked as though it had survived a lifetime of tavern brawls. "Oh, ain't I?" "Is that thing loaded?" Sharpe nodded at the pistol at Lockhart's belt. A sabre also hung there, just like the one at Sharpe's hip. "It will be." Lockhart drew the pistol, and Sharpe turned to Ahmed and mimed the actions of loading the musket. Ahmed grinned and pointed to the lock, indicating that his weapon was already charged. "How many of the buggers will be waiting for us?" Lockhart asked. "A dozen," Sharpe guessed. Lockhart glanced back at his 6 men. "We can deal with a dozen buggers?" "Right," Sharpe said. "So let's bloody well make some trouble." He grinned, because for the first time since he'd become an officer, he was enjoying himself, which meant someone was about to get a thumping. Chapter 3. Major General Sir Arthur Wellesley rode northwards among a cavalcade of officers whose horses kicked up a wide trail of dust that lingered in the air long after the horsemen had passed. 2 troops of East India Company cavalry provided the general's escort. Manu Bapu's army might have been trounced, and its survivors sent skeltering back into Gavalgur, but the Deccan plain was still infested with Maratha cavalry ready to pounce on supply convoys, woodcutting parties, or the grass-cutters who supplied the army's animals with fodder. And so the 2 troops rode with sabres drawn. Wellesley set a fast pace, revelling in the freedom to ride in the long open country. "Did you visit Colonel Stevenson this morning?" he called back to an aide. "I did, sir, and he's no better than he was." "But he can get about?" "On his elephant, sir." Wellesley grunted. Stevenson was the commander of his smaller army, but the old colonel was ailing. So was Harness, the commander of one of Wellesley's 2 brigades, but there was no point in asking about Harness. It was not just physical disease that assaulted Harness, for the Scotsman's wits were gone as well. The doctors claimed it was the heat that had desiccated his brains, but Wellesley doubted the diagnosis. Heat and rum may be, but not the heat alone, though he didn't doubt that India's climate was bad for a European's health. Few men lived long without falling prey to some wasting fever, and Wellesley was thinking it was time he left himself. Time to go back home before his health was abraded, and, more important, before his existence was forgotten in London. French armies were unsettling all Europe, and it couldn't be long before London dispatched an army to fight the old foe, and Wellesley wanted to be a part of it. He was in his middle 30s, and he had a reputation to make. But first he had to finish off the Marathas, and that meant taking Gavalgur. And to that end he was now riding towards the great rampart of cliffs that sealed off the plain's northern edge. An hour's ride brought him to the summit of a small rise which offered a view northwards. The plain looked done, starved of water by the failed monsoon, though here and there patches of millet grew tall. In a good year, Wellesley guessed, the millet would cover the plain from horizon to horizon, a sea of grain bounded by the Gavalgur cliffs. He dismounted on the small knoll and took out a telescope that he settled on his horse's saddle. It was a brand-new glass, a gift from the merchants of Madras to mark Wellesley's pacification of Mysore. Trade now moved freely on India's eastern flank, and the telescope, which had been specially ordered from Matthew Burge of London, was a generous token of the merchant's esteem. But Wellesley could not get used to it. The shape of the eyepiece was less concave than the one he was used to, and after a moment he snapped the new telescope shut and pulled out his old glass, which, though lower-powered, was more comfortable. He stared for a long time, gazing at the fort which crowned the rock promontory. The black stone of the fortress walls looked particularly sinister, even in the sunlight. "Good God," the general muttered after a while. Fail up there, he thought, and there'd be no point in going home. He could go to London with some victories under his belt, and men would respect him even if the victories had not been against the French. But go with a defeat, and they'd despise him. Gavalgur, he thought sourly, had the look of a career-breaker. Colonel Wallace, Wellesley's healthy brigade commander, had also dismounted, and was inspecting the fortress through his own glass. "Devil of a place, Sir Arthur," Wallace said. "How high is it, Blackiston?" Wellesley called to one of his aides, an engineer. "I took a triangulation yesterday, sir," Blackiston said, "and discovered the fortress walls are 1,800 feet above the plain." "Is there water up there?" Colonel Butters, the chief engineer, asked. "We hear there is, sir," Blackiston said. "Things in the fort, huge things like lakes. But the water level must be low this year," Butters suggested. "I doubt it's low enough, sir," Blackiston murmured, knowing that Butters had been hoping that thirst might defeat the garrison. "And the rascals will have food, no doubt," Wellesley commented. "Doubtless," Wallace agreed dryly. "Which means they'll have to be prized out," the general said, then bent to the glass again and lowered the lens to look at the foothills below the bluff. Just south of the fort was a conical hill that rose almost halfway up the flank of the great promontory. "Can we get guns on that near hill?" he asked. There was a pause while the other officers decided which hill he was referring to. Colonel Butters flinched. "Well, we can get them up there, sir, but I doubt they'll have the elevation to reach the fort." "You'll get nothing bigger than a 12-pounder up there," Wallace said dubiously, then slid the telescope's view up the bluff to the walls.
And you'll need bigger shot than 12-pounders to break down that wall. Sharpe!
The warning call came from the officer commanding the East India Company cavalry, who was pointing to where a group of Maratha horsemen had appeared in the south. They had evidently been following the lingering dust cloud left by the general's party, and though the approaching horsemen only numbered about 20 men, the sepoy cavalry wheeled to face them and spread into a line.
"It's all right," Wellesley called. "They're ours. I asked them to meet us here."
He had inspected the approaching horsemen through his telescope, and now, waving the sepoy cavalry back, he walked to greet the Siladas.
"Sayud Sevaji!"
Wellesley acknowledged the man in the shabby green and silver coat who led the cavalrymen.
"Thank you for coming."
Sayud Sevaji nodded brusquely at Wellesley, then stared up at Gavilgur.
"You think you can get in?" "I think we must," Wellesley said. "No one ever has," Sevaji said with a sly smile.
Wellesley returned the smile, but slowly, as if accepting the implied challenge, and then, as Sevaji slid down from his saddle, the general turned to Wallace.
"You've met Sayud Sevaji, Wallace?" "I've not had that pleasure, sir."
Wellesley made the introduction, then added that Sayud Sevaji's father had been one of the Raja of Berat's generals.
"But is no longer?"
Wallace asked Sevaji.
"Benny Singh murdered him,"
Sevaji said grimly.
"So I fight with you, Colonel, to gain my chance to kill Benny Singh. And Benny Singh now commands that fortress."
He nodded towards the distant promontory.
"So, how do we get inside?"
Wellesley asked. The officers gathered around Sevaji as the Indian drew his tulwar and used its tip to draw a figure 8 in the dust. He tapped the lower circle of the 8, which he'd drawn far larger than the upper.
"That's what you're looking at," he said. "The inner fort. And there are only 2 entrances. There's a road that climbs up from the plain and goes to the southern gate."
He drew a squiggly line that tailed away from the bottom of the figure 8.
"But that road is impossible. You will climb straight into their guns. A child with a pile of rocks could keep an army from climbing that road. The only possible route into the inner fort is through the main entrance."
He scratched a brief line across the junction of the 2 circles.
"Which will not be easy?"
Wellesley asked dryly. Sevaji offered the general a grim smile.
"The main entrance is a long corridor, barred by 4 gates and flanked by high walls. But even to reach it, Sir Arthur, you will have to take the outer fort."
He tapped the smaller upper circle of the figure 8. Wellesley nodded.
"And that too is difficult."
"Again, 2 entrances," Sevaji said.
"One is a road that climbs from the plain. You can't see it from here, but it twists up the hills to the west, and it comes to the fort, here."
He tapped the waist of the figure 8.
"It's an easier climb than the southern road, but for the last mile of the journey, your men will be under the guns of the outer fort. And the final half-mile, General, is steep."
He stressed the last word.
"On one side of the road is a cliff, and on the other is a precipice, and the guns of the outer fort can fire straight down that half-mile of road."
Colonel Butters shook his head in gloomy contemplation of Sevaji's news.
"How come you know all this?" he asked. "I grew up in Gavilgur," Sevaji said. "My father, before he was murdered, was Kilada of the fortress." "He knows," Wellesley said curtly. "And the main entrance to the outer fort?"
"That," Sevaji said, "is the fortress's weakest point." He scratched a line that pierced the uppermost curve of the small circle.
"It's the only level approach to the fortress, but it's very narrow. On one side," he tapped the eastern flank of the line, "the ground falls steeply away. On the other is a reservoir tank, so to reach the fort you must risk a narrow neck of land that is swept by 2 ramparts of guns, one above the other." "Two walls?" Wallace asked. "Set on a steep hill," Sevaji said, nodding. "You must fight uphill across both walls. There's an entrance, but it's like the inner fort's entrance, a series of gates with a narrow passage leading from one to the other, and men above you on both sides hauling down rocks and round-shot." "And once we've captured the outer fort," Wellesley asked, "what then?"
Sevaji offered a wolfish smile.
"Then your troubles are just beginning, Sir Arthur.
He scuffed out the diagram he had made in the dust and scratched another. This one showing 2 circles, one large and one small, with a space between them. The 2 forts are not connected. They are separated here. He tapped the space between the circles with his tulba. And that is a ravine, a deep ravine. So once you have the outer fort, you still have to assault the inner fort. And its defenses will be untouched. It has a wall which stands at the top of the ravine's cliff, and that is where your enemy will be taking refuge, inside the wall of the inner fort. My father reckoned no enemy could ever capture Gavelgur's inner fort. If all India should fall, he said, then its heart would still beat at Gavelgur. Wellesley walked a few paces north to stare at the high promontory. How big is the garrison? Normally, Savaji said, about 1,000 men. But now, it could be 6 or 7 times that many. There is room inside for a whole army. And if the fort didn't fall, Wellesley thought, then the Marathas would take heart. They'd gather a new army, and in the new year raid southwards again. There would be no peace in western India till Gavelgur fell. Major Blackiston. Sir. You'll make an exploration of the plateau. The general turned to Savaji. Will you escort Major Blackiston up into the hills? I want sketches, Blackiston, of the neck of land leading to the main entrance. I want you to tell me where we can place breaching batteries. I need to know how we can get guns up to the top of the hills. And I need to know it all within 2 days. 2 days? Blackiston sounded appalled. Well, we don't want the rascals to take root up there, do we? Speed, Blackiston, speed. Can you leave now? His question was directed at Savaji. I can, Savaji answered. Wellesley waved Blackiston on his way. 2 days, Major. I want you back tomorrow evening. Colonel Butters frowned at the far hills. You're taking the army to the top? Half the army, Wellesley said. The other half will stay on the plain. He would need to hold Gavelgur between his redcoats like a nut, and hope that when he squeezed, it was the nut and not the nutcracker that broke. He pulled himself back into the saddle, then waited as the other officers mounted. Then he turned his mare and started back towards the camp. It'll be up to the engineers to get us onto the heights, he said. Then a week's hard carrying to lift the ammunition to the batteries. The thought of that job made the general frown. What's the problem with a bullock train? He demanded of Butters. I'm hearing complaints. Over 2,000 muskets stolen from convoys, and Huddleston tells me there are no spare horseshoes. That can't be right. Torrance says that bandits have been active, sir, Butters said. And I gather there have been accidents, he added lamely. Who's Torrance? Wellesley asked. Company man, sir, a captain. He took over Paul Mackay's duties. Well, I could surmise all that for myself, the general said acidly. Who is he? Butters blushed at the reproof. His father's a canon at Wells, I think, or maybe Salisbury, but more to the point, sir, he has an uncle in Leadenhall Street. Wellesley grunted. An uncle in Leadenhall Street meant that Torrance had a patron who was senior in the East India Company, someone to wield the influence that a clergyman father might not have. Is he as good as Mackay? Butters, a heavy-set man who rode his horse badly, shrugged. Well, he was recommended by Huddlestone, which means Huddlestone wanted to be rid of him. Wellesley snapped. Well, I'm sure he's doing his best, Butters said defensively, though he did ask me for an assistant, but I had to turn him down. I've no one to spare. I'm short of engineers already, sir, as you well know. I've sent for more, Wellesley said. Wallace intervened. I gave Torrance one of my ensigns, Sir Arthur. You can spare an ensign, Wallace? Sharpe, sir. Ah! Wellesley grimaced. Never does work out, does it? You lift from the ranks, and you do him no favours. He might be happier in an English regiment, Wallace said, so I'm recommending he exchanges into the Rifles. You mean they're not particular? Wellesley asked, then scowled. How the devil are we to fight a war without horseshoes? He kicked back at the mare, angry at the predicament. My God, Butters, but your Captain Torrance must do his job. Wellesley, better than anyone, knew that he could never take Gavelgur if the supply train failed. And Gavelgur had never been taken. Dear God, Wellesley thought, how was it ever to be done? big buggers," Sergeant Eli Lockhart murmured as they neared the two green tents. The cavalryman was speaking of the guards who lolled in chairs outside Naig's tents. There were 4 in view, and 2 of them had bare, oiled chests that bulged with unnatural muscle. Their hair was never cut, but was instead coiled around their heads. They were keeping guard outside the larger of the tents. The one Sharpe guessed was Naig's brothel. The other tent might have been the merchant's living quarters, but its entrance was tightly laced, so Sharpe couldn't glimpse inside. "The 2 greasy fellows are the jetties," Sharpe said. "Big as bloody beeves, they are," Lockhart said. "Do they really wring your neck?" "Back to front," Sharpe said, "or else they drive a nail into your skull with their bare hand." He swerved aside to go past the tents. It was not that he feared to pick a fight with Naig's guards. Indeed, he expected a scrap, but there was no point in going bald-headed into battle. A bit of cleverness would not go amiss. "I'm being canny," he explained to Lockhart, then turned to make sure that Ahmed was keeping up. The boy was holding Sharpe's pack as well as his musket. The 4 guards, all of them armed with firelocks and tulwars, watched the British soldiers walk out of sight. "I didn't like the look of us," Lockhart said. "Mangy buggers they are," Sharpe said. He was glancing about the encampment and saw what he wanted just a few paces away. It was some straw, and near it was a smouldering campfire, and he screwed a handful of the straw stalks into a spill that he lit and carried to the rear of the smaller tent. He pushed the flaming spill into a fold of the canvas. A child watched, wide-eyed. "If you say anything," Sharpe told the half-naked child, "I'll screw your head off back to front." The child, who didn't understand a word, grinned broadly. "You're not really supposed to be doing this, are you?" Lockhart asked. "Nope," Sharpe said. Lockhart grinned but said nothing. Instead, he just watched as the flames licked at the faded green canvas, which for a moment or 2 resisted the fire. The material blackened but didn't burn. Then suddenly it burst into fire that licked greedily up the tent's high side. "That'll wake 'em up," Sharpe said. "What now?" Lockhart asked, watching the flames sear up the tent's side. "We rescue what's inside, of course." Sharpe drew his sabre. "Come on, lads." He ran back to the front of the tent. "Fire!" he shouted. "Fire! Fetch water! Fire!" The 4 guards stared uncomprehendingly at the Englishman, then leapt to their feet as Sharpe slashed at the laces of the small tent's doorway. One of them called a protest to Sharpe. "Fire!" Lockhart bellowed at the guards, who, still unsure of what was happening, didn't try to stop Sharpe. Then one of them saw the smoke billowing over the ridge of the tent. He yelled a warning into the larger tent, as his companion suddenly moved to pull the Englishman away from the tent's entrance. "Hold them off!" Sharpe called, and Lockhart's 6 troopers closed on the 3 men. Sharpe slashed at the lacing, hacking down through the tough rope as the troopers thumped into the guards. Someone swore. There was a grunt as a fist landed, then a yelp as a trooper's boot slammed into a jetty's groin. Sharpe sawed through the last knot, then pushed through the loosened tent flaps. "Jesus!" He stopped, staring at the boxes and barrels and crates that were stacked in the tent's smoky gloom. Lockhart had followed him inside. "Doesn't even bother to hide the stuff properly, does he?" the sergeant said in amazement, then crossed to a barrel and pointed to a 19 that had been cut into one of the staves. "That's our mark! The bugger's got half our supplies!" He looked up at the flames that were now eating away the tent roof. "We'll lose the bloody lot if we don't watch it." "Cut the tent ropes," Sharpe suggested, "and push it all down." The 2 men ran outside and slashed at the guy ropes with their sabres, but more of Naig's men were coming from the larger tent now. "Watch your back, Eli!" Sharpe called, then turned and sliced the curved blade towards a jetty's face. The man stepped back, and Sharpe followed up hard, slashing again, driving the huge man further back. "Now bugger off!" he shouted at the vast brute. "There's a bloody fire! Fire!" Lockhart had put his attacker on the ground and was now stamping on his face with a spurred boot. The troopers were coming to help, and Sharpe let them deal with Naig's men while he cut through the last of the guy ropes, then ran back into the tent and heaved on the nearest pole. The air inside the tent was choking with swirling smoke, but at last the whole heavy array of canvas sagged towards the fire, lifting the canvas wall behind Sharpe into the air. "Sahib!" Ahmed's shrill voice shouted, and Sharpe turned to see a man aiming a musket at him. The lifting tent flamp was exposing Sharpe, but he was too far away to rush the man. Then Ahmed fired his own musket, and the man shuddered, turned to look at the boy, then winced as the pain in his shoulder struck home. He dropped the gun and clapped a hand onto the wound. The sound of the shot startled the other guards, and some reached for their own muskets. But Sharpe ran at them and used his sabre to beat the guns down. "There's a bloody fire!" he shouted into their faces. "A fire! You want everything to burn?" They didn't understand him, but some realized that the fire threatened their master's supplies, and so ran to haul the half-collapsed burning canvas away from the wooden crates. "But who started the fire?" a voice said behind Sharpe, and he turned to see a tall, fat Indian dressed in a green robe that was embroidered with looping fish and long-legged water-birds. The fat man was holding a half-naked child by the hand, the same small boy who had watched Sharpe push the burning straw into a crease of the canvas. "British officers," the fat man said, "have a deal of freedom in this country, but does that mean they can destroy an honest man's property?" "Are you Naig?" Sharpe asked. The fat man waved to his guards so that they gathered behind him. The tent had been dragged clear of the crates and was burning itself out harmlessly. The green-robed man now had 16 or 17 men with him, 4 of them jetties and all of them armed, while Sharpe had Lockhart and his battered troopers and one defiant child who was reloading a musket as tall as himself. "I will give you my name," the fat man said unpleasantly, "when you tell me yours." "Sharpe. Ensign Sharpe." "A mere ensign!" The fat man raised his eyebrows. "I thought ensigns were children, like this young man." He patted the half-naked boy's head. "I am Naig." "So perhaps you can tell me," Sharpe said, "why that tent was stuffed full of our supplies." "Your supplies?" Naig laughed. "They are my goods, Ensign Sharpe. Perhaps some of them are stored in old boxes that once belonged to your army, but what of that? I buy the boxes from the quartermaster's department." "Lying bastard," Sergeant Lockhart growled. He had prized open the barrel with the number 19 incised on its side, and now flourished a horseshoe. "Ours," he said. Naig seemed about to order his guards to finish off Sharpe's small band, but then he glanced to his right and saw that 2 British officers had come from the larger tent. The presence of the 2, both captains, meant that Naig could not just drive Sharpe away, for now there were witnesses. Naig might take on an ensign and a few troopers, but captains carried too much authority. One of the captains, who wore the red coat of the Scotch Brigade, crossed to Sharpe. "Trouble?" he asked. His revels had plainly been interrupted, for his trousers were still unbuttoned, and his sword and sash were slung across one shoulder. "This bastard, sir, has been pilfering our supplies." Sharpe jerked his thumb at Naig, then nodded towards the crates. "It's all marked as stolen in the supply ledgers, but I'll wager it's all there. Buckets, muskets, horseshoes." The captain glanced at Naig, then crossed to the crates. "Open that one," he ordered, and Lockhart obediently stooped to the box and levered up its nailed lid with his sabre. "I have been storing these boxes," Naig explained. He turned to the second captain, an extraordinarily elegant cavalryman in company uniform, and he pleaded with him in an Indian language. The company captain turned away, and Naig went back to the Scotsman. The merchant was in trouble now, and he knew it. "I was asked to store the boxes," he shouted at the Scotsman. But the infantry captain was staring down into the opened crate, where 10 brand-new muskets lay in their wooden cradles. He stooped for one of the muskets and peered at the lock. Just forward of the hammer, and behind the pan, was an engraved crown with the letters G.R. beneath it, while behind the hammer the word Tower was engraved. "Ours," the Scotsman said flatly. "I bought them." Naig was sweating now. "I thought you said you were storing them," the Scotsman said. "Now you say you bought them. Which is it?" "My brother and I bought the guns from Siladars," Naig said. "We don't sell these Tower muskets," hefting the gun that was still coated with grease. Naig shrugged. "They must have been captured from the supply convoys. Please, Sahib, take them. I want no trouble. How was I to know they were stolen?" He turned and pleaded again with the company cavalry captain,
He was a tall, lean man with a long face, but the cavalryman turned and walked a short distance away. A crowd had collected now and watched the drama silently, and Sharpe, looking along their faces, suspected there wasn't much sympathy for Naig. Nor, Sharpe thought, was there much hope for the fat man. Naig had been playing a dangerous game, but with such utter confidence that he hadn't even bothered to conceal the stolen supplies. At the very least, he could have thrown away the government-issue boxes and tried to file the lock markings off the muskets. But Naig must have believed he had powerful friends who could protect him. The cavalryman seemed to be one of those friends, for Naig had followed him and was hissing in his ear. But the cavalryman merely pushed the Indian away, then turned to Sharpe. "Hang him," he said curtly. "Hang him?" Sharpe asked in puzzlement. "It's the penalty for theft, ain't it?" the cavalryman insisted. Sharpe looked to the Scottish captain, who nodded uncertainly. "That's what the general said," the Scotsman confirmed. "Well, I'd like to know how he got the supplies, sir," Sharpe said. "You'll give the fat bastard time to concoct a story?" the cavalryman demanded. He had an arrogance that annoyed Sharpe, but everything about the cavalryman irritated Sharpe. The man was a dandy. He wore tall, spurred boots that sheathed his calves and knees in soft, polished leather. His white breeches were skin-tight. His waistcoat had gold buttons, while his red tailcoat was clean, uncreased, and edged with gold braid. He wore a frilled stock. A red silk sash was draped across his right shoulder and secured at his left hip by a knot of golden braid. His sabre was scabbarded in red leather, while his cocked hat was plumed with a lavishly curled feather that had been dyed pale green. The clothes had cost a fortune, and clearly his servants must spend hours on keeping their master so beautifully dressed. He looked askance at Sharpe, a slight wrinkle of his nostrils suggesting that he found Sharpe's appearance distressing. The cavalryman's face suggested he was a clever man, but also that he despised those who were less clever than himself. "I don't suppose Sir Arthur will be vastly pleased when he hears that you let the fellow live, Ensign?" he said acidly. "Swift and certain justice. Ain't that the penalty for theft? Hang the fat beast." "That's what the standing orders say," the Scotch brigade captain agreed. "But does it apply to civilians?" "He should have a trial," Sharpe protested. Not because he was so committed to Naig's right to a hearing, but because he feared the whole episode was getting out of hand. He had thought to find the supplies, maybe have a mill with Naig's guards, but no one was supposed to die. Naig deserved a good kicking, but death. "Standing orders apply to anyone within the picket lines," the cavalry captain averred confidently. "So for God's sake, get on with it. Dangle the bastard!" He was sweating, and Sharpe sensed that the elegant cavalryman was not quite so confident as he appeared. "Buggery trial," Sergeant Lockhart said happily. "I'll hang the bastard." He snapped at his troopers to fetch a nearby ox-cart. Naig had tried to retreat to the protection of his guards, but the cavalry captain had drawn a pistol that he now held close to Naig's head as the grinning troopers trundled the empty ox-cart into the open space in front of the pilfered supplies. Sharpe crossed to the tall cavalryman. "Shouldn't we talk to him, sir?" "My dear fellow, have you ever tried to get the truth out of an Indian?" the captain asked. "They swear by 1,000 gaudy gods that they'll tell the truth, then lie like a rug. Be quiet!" Naig had begun to protest, and the cavalryman rammed the pistol into the Indian's mouth, breaking a tooth and gashing Naig's gum. "Another damned word, Naig, and I'll castrate you before I hang you." The cavalryman glanced at Sharpe, who was frowning. "Are you squeamish, Ensign?" "Don't seem right, sir. I mean, I agree he deserves to be hung, but shouldn't we talk to him first?" "If you like conversation so much," the cavalryman drawled, "institute a philosophical society. Then you can enjoy all the hot air you like. Sergeant?" This last was to Lockhart. "Take the bastard off my hands, will you?" "Pleasure, sir." Lockhart seized Naig and shoved him towards the cart. One of the cavalry troopers had cut a length of guy rope from the burnt remnants of the tent, and he now tied one end to the tip of the single shaft that protruded from the front of the ox-cart. He made a loop in the rope's end. Naig screamed and tried to pull away.
Some of his guards started forward, but then a hard voice ordered them back, and Sharpe turned to see that a tall, thin Indian in a black and green striped robe had come from the larger tent. The newcomer, who looked to be in his 40s, walked with a limp. He crossed to the cavalry captain and spoke quietly, and Sharpe saw the cavalryman shake his head vehemently, then shrug as if to suggest that he was powerless. Then the captain gestured to Sharpe, and the tall Indian gave the ensign a look of such malevolence that Sharpe instinctively put his hand on his sabre's hilt. Lockhart had pulled the noose over Naig's head. "You sure, sir?" he asked the cavalry captain. "Of course I'm sure, Sergeant," the cavalryman said angrily. "Just get on with it." "Sir?" Sharpe appealed to the Scots captain, who frowned uncertainly, then turned and walked away as though he wanted nothing more to do with the affair. The tall Indian in the striped robe spat into the dust, then limped back to the tent. Lockhart ordered his troopers to the back of the cart. Naig was attempting to pull the noose free of his neck, but Lockhart slapped his hands down. "Now, boys!" he shouted. The troopers reached up and hauled down on the backboard, so that the cart tipped like a seesaw on its single axle, and as the troopers pulled down, so the shaft rose into the air. The rope stretched and tightened. Naig screamed. Then the cavalryman jumped up to sit on the cart's back, and the shaft jerked higher still, and the scream was abruptly choked off. Naig was dangling now, his feet kicking wildly under the lavishly embroidered robe. None of the crowd moved. None protested. Naig's face was bulging, and his hands were scrabbling uselessly at the noose which was tight about his neck. The cavalry officer watched with a small smile. "A pity," he said in his elegant voice. "The wretched man ran the best brothel I ever found." "We're not killing his girls, sir," Sharpe said. "That's true, Ensign, but will their next owner treat them as well?" The cavalryman turned to the big tent's entrance and took off his plumed hat to salute a group of sari-clad girls who now watched wide-eyed as their employer did the gallows dance. "I saw Nancy Merrick hang in Madras," the cavalryman said, "and she did the jig for 37 minutes. 37! I'd wagered on 16. So lost, rather a lot of tin. Don't think I can watch Naig dance for half an hour. It's too damned hot. Sergeant, help his soul to perdition, will you?" Lockhart crouched beneath the dying man and caught hold of his heels. Then he tugged down hard, swearing when Naig pissed on him. He tugged again, and at last the body went still. "You see what happens when you steal from us?" The cavalry captain shouted at the crowd, then repeated the words in an Indian language. "If you steal from us, you'll die." Again he translated his words, then gave Sharpe a crooked grin. "But only, of course, if you're stupid enough to be caught. And I didn't think Naig was stupid at all. Rather the reverse. Just how did you happen to discover the supplies, Ensign?" "Temp was on fire, sir," Sharpe said woodenly. "Me and Sergeant Lockhart decided to rescue whatever was inside." "How very public-spirited of you." The captain gave Sharpe a long, speculative look, then turned back to Lockhart. "Is he dead, Sergeant?" "Near as makes no difference, sir," Lockhart called back. "Use your pistol to make sure," the captain ordered, then sighed. "Shame," he said. "I rather liked Naig. He was a rogue, of course, but rogues are so much more amusing than honest men." He watched as Lockhart lowered the shaft, then stooped over the prostrate body and put a bullet into its skull. "I suppose I'll have to find some carts to fetch these supplies back where they belong," the captain said. "I'll do that, sir," Sharpe said. "You will?" The captain seemed astonished to discover such willingness. "Why on earth would you want to do that, Ensign?" "It's my job, sir," Sharpe said. "I'm Captain Torrance's assistant." "You poor benighted bastard," the captain said pityingly. "Poor, sir? Why?" "Because I'm Captain Torrance. Good day to you, Ensign." Torrance turned on his heel and walked away through the crowd. "Bastard," Sharpe said, for he had suddenly understood why Torrance had been so keen to hang Naig. He spat after the departed captain, then went to find some bullocks and carts.
The army had its supplies back, but Sharpe had made a new enemy. As if Hakeswell were not enough, he now had Torrance as well. The palace in Gavilgur was a sprawling one-story building that stood on the highest point within the inner fort. To its north was a garden that curled about the largest of the fortress's lakes. The lake was a tank, a reservoir, but its banks had been planted with flowering trees, and a flight of steps led from the palace to a small stone pavilion on the lake's northern shore. The pavilion had an arched ceiling, on which the reflections of the lake's small waves should have rippled, but the season had been so dry that the lake had shrunk, and the water level was some 8 or 9 feet lower than usual. The water and the exposed banks were rimed with a green, foul-smelling scum, but Benny Singh, the Kiladar of Gavilgur, had arranged for spices to be burned in low, flat braziers, so that the dozen men inside the pavilion were not too offended by the lake's stench. "If only the Rajah was here," Benny Singh said, "we should know what to do." Benny Singh was a short, plump man with a curling moustache and nervous eyes. He was the fortress commander, but he was a courtier by avocation, not a soldier, and he'd always regarded his command of the great fortress as a license to make his fortune, rather than to fight the Rajah's enemies. Prince Manu Bapu was not surprised that his brother had chosen not to come to Gavilgur, but had instead fled further into the hills. The Rajah was like Benny Singh. He had no belly for a fight. But Bapu had watched the first British troops creep across the plain beneath the fort's high walls, and he welcomed their coming. "We don't need my brother here to know what we must do," he said. "We fight." The other men, all commanders of the various troops that had taken refuge in Gavilgur, voiced their agreement. "The British cannot be stopped by walls," Benny Singh said. He was cradling a small white lapdog, which had eyes as wide and frightened as its master's. "They can, and they will," Bapu insisted. Singh shook his head. "Were they stopped at Seringapatam, at Ahmednagar, they crushed those city walls as though they had wings. They are, what is the word your Arabs use, jinns." He looked about the gathered council and saw no one who would support him. "They must have the jinns on their side," he added weakly. "So what would you do?" Bapu asked. "Treat with them," Benny Singh said. "Ask for Cowley." "Cowley?" It was Colonel Dodd who intervened, speaking in his crude, newly learned Marathi. "I'll tell you what terms Wellesley will offer you. None! He'll march you away as a prisoner. He'll slight these walls and take away the Rajah's treasure." "There are no treasures here," Benny Singh said, but no one believed him. He was soothing the little dog, which had been frightened by the Englishman's harsh voice. "And he'll give your women to his men as playthings," Dodd added nastily. Benny Singh shuddered. His wife, his concubines, and his children were all in the palace, and they were all dear to him. He pampered them, worshipped them, and adored them. Perhaps I should remove my people from the fort," he suggested hesitantly. "I could take them to Multai. The British will never reach Multai." "You'd run away?" Dodd asked in his harsh voice. "You bloody won't." He spoke those 3 words in English, but everyone understood what they meant. He leant forward. "If you run away," he said, "the garrison loses heart. The rest of the soldiers can't take their women away, so why should you? We fight them here and we stop them here. Stop them dead." He stood and walked to the pavilion's edge, where he spat onto the green-scummed bank before turning back to Benny Singh. "Your women are safe here, Kilada. I could hold this fortress from now till the world's end, with just 100 men." "The British are jinns," Benny Singh whispered. The dog in his arms was shivering. "They're not jinns," Dodd snapped. "There are no demons. They don't exist." "Winged jinns," Benny Singh said in almost a whimper. "Invisible jinns in the air." Dodd spat again. "Bloody hell," he said in English, then turned fast towards Benny Singh. "I'm an English demon, me. Understand, I'm a jinn. And if you take your women away, I'll follow you and I'll come to them at night and fill them with black bile." He bared his yellow teeth, and the Kiladar shuddered. The white dog barked shrilly. Manu Bapu waved Dodd back to his seat.
Dodd was the only European officer left in his forces, and though Bapu was glad to have the Englishman's services, there were times when Colonel Dodd could be tiresome. "If there are jinns," Bapu told Singh, "they will be on our side." He waited while the Keladar soothed the frightened dog, then he leant forward. "Tell me," he demanded of Benny Singh, "can the British take the fortress by using the roads up the hill?" Benny Singh thought about those 2 steep winding roads that twisted up the hill beneath Gavelgor's walls. No man could survive those climbs, not if the defenders were raining round-shot and rocks down the precipitous slopes. "No," he admitted. "So, they can only come one way, only one way, across the land bridge, and my men will guard the outer fort, and Colonel Dodd's men will defend the inner fort." "And no one," Dodd said harshly, "no one will get past my cobras." He still resented that his well-trained white-coated soldiers were not defending the outer fort, but he'd accepted Manu Bapu's argument that the important thing was to hold the inner fort. If, by some chance, the British did capture the outer fort, they would never fight past Dodd's men. "My men," Dodd growled, "have never been defeated. They never will be." Manu Bapu smiled at the nervous Benny Singh. "You see, Keladar, you will die here of old age." "Or of too many women," another man put in, provoking laughter. A cannon sounded from the outer fort's northern ramparts, followed a few seconds later by another. No one knew what might have caused the firing, and so the 12 men followed Manu Bapu as he left the pavilion and walked towards the inner fort's northern ramparts. Silver-furred monkeys chattered at the soldiers from the high branches. Arab guards stood at the gate of the Rajah's garden. They were posted to stop any common soldiers of the garrison going to the paths beside the tank where the Keladar's men liked to stroll in the cool of the evening. 100 paces beyond the garden gate was a steep-sided rock pit, about twice as deep as a man stood high, and Dodd paused to look down into its shadowed depths. The sides had been chiselled smooth by stoneworkers, so that nothing could climb up from the floor that was littered with white bones. "The traitor's hole," Bapu said, as he paused beside Dodd. "But the bones are from baby monkeys." "But they do eat men?" Dodd asked, intrigued by the shadowed blackness at the foot of the hole. "They kill men," Bapu said, "but don't eat them. They're not—" "Well, I can't see any," Dodd said, disappointed. Then suddenly a sinuous shadow writhed swiftly between 2 crevices. "There," he said happily. "Don't they grow big enough to eat men?" "Most years they escape," Bapu said. "The monsoon floods the pit, and the snakes swim to the top and wriggle out. Then we must find new ones. This year we've been saved the trouble. These snakes will grow bigger than usual." Benny Singh waited a few paces away, clutching his small dog, as though he feared Dodd would throw it down to the snakes. "There's a bastard who ought to be fed to the snakes," Dodd said to Bapu, nodding towards the Keladar. "My brother likes him," Bapu said mildly, touching Dodd's arm to indicate that they should walk on. "They share tastes." "Such as?" "Women, music, luxury. We really do not need him here." Dodd shook his head. "If you let him go, Sahib, then half the damn garrison will want to run away, and if you let the women go, what will the men fight for? Besides, do you really think there's any danger?" "None," Bapu admitted. He led the officers up a steep rock stairway to a natural bastion, where a vast iron gun was trained across the chasm towards the distant cliffs of the high plateau. From here, the far cliffs were almost a mile away, but Dodd could just see a group of horsemen clustered at the chasm's edge. It was those horsemen, all in native robes, who had prompted the outer fort's gunners to open fire. But the gunners, seeing their shots fall well short of the target, had given up. Dodd drew out his telescope, trained it, and saw a man in the uniform of the Royal Engineers sitting on the ground, a few paces from his companions. The engineer was sketching. The horsemen were all Indians. Dodd lowered the telescope and looked at the huge iron gun. "Is it loaded?" he asked the gunners. "Yes, Sahib." "A hidery apiece if you can kill the man in the dark uniform, the one sitting at the cliff's edge." The gunners laughed. Their gun was over 20 feet long, and its wrought-iron barrel was cast with decorations that had been painted green, white, and red. A pile of round shot, each over a foot in diameter, stood beside the massive carriage that was made from giant baulks of teak. The gun captain fussed over his aim, shouting at his men to lever the vast carriage a thumb's width to the right, then a finger's breadth back, until at last he was satisfied. He squinted along the barrel for a second, waved the officers who'd followed Bapu to move away from the great gun, then leant over the breech to dab his glowing port-fire onto the gun's touch-hole. The reed glowed and smoked for a second as the fire dashed down to the charge. Then the vast cannon crashed back, the teak runners sliding up the timber ramp that formed the lower half of the carriage. Smoke jetted out into the chasm as 100 startled birds flapped from their nests on the rock faces and circled in the warm air. Dodd had been standing to one side, watching the engineer through his glass. For a second he actually saw the great round shot as a flicker of grey in the lower right quadrant of his lens. Then he saw a boulder close to the engineer shatter into scraps. The engineer fell sideways, his sketchpad falling. But then he picked himself up and scrambled up the slope to where his horse was being guarded by the cavalrymen. Dodd took a single gold coin from his pouch and tossed it to the gunner. "You missed," he said, "but it was damn fine shooting." "Thank you, Sahib." A whimper made Dodd turn. Benny Singh had handed his dog to a servant and was staring through an ivory-barreled telescope at the enemy horseman. "What is it?" Bapu asked him. "Sayud Sevaji," Singh said in a small voice. "Who's Sayud Sevaji?" Dodd asked. Bapu grinned. "His father was once Kilada here, but he died." "Was it poison?" he asked Benny Singh. "He just died," Singh said. "He just died." "Murdered, probably," Bapu said with amusement. "And Benny Singh became Kilada and took the dead man's daughter as his concubine." Dodd turned to see the enemy horseman vanishing among the trees beyond the far cliff. "Come for revenge, has he? You still want to leave?" he demanded of Benny Singh. "Because that fellow will be waiting for you. He'll track you through the hills, Killadar, and slit your throat in the night's darkness." "We shall stay here and fight," Benny Singh declared, retrieving the dog from his servant. "Fight and win," Dodd said. And he imagined the British breaching batteries on that far cliff, and he imagined the slaughter that would be made among the crews by this one vast gun. And there were 50 other heavy guns waiting to greet the British approach, and hundreds of lighter pieces that fired smaller missiles. Guns, rockets, canister, muskets, and cliffs. Those were Gavelgur's defences, and Dodd reckoned the British stood no chance. No chance at all. The big gun's smoke drifted away in the small breeze. "They'll die here," Dodd said, "and we'll chase the survivors south and cut them down like dogs." He turned and looked at Benny Singh. "You see the chasm? That's where their demons will die. Their wings will be scorched. They'll fall like burning stones to their deaths, and their screams will lull your children to a dreamless sleep." He knew he spoke true, for Gavelgur was impregnable. "I take pleasure— no, Dilip, make that— I take humble pleasure in reporting the recovery of a quantity of stolen stores." Captain Torrance paused. Night had just fallen, and Torrance uncorked a bottle of arrack and took a sip. "Am I going too fast for you?" "Yes, Sahib," Dilip, the middle-aged clerk, answered. "Humble pleasure," he said aloud as his pen moved laboriously over the paper, "in reporting the recovery of a quantity of stolen stores." "Add a list of the stores," Torrance ordered. "You can do that later. Just leave a space, man." "Yes, Sahib," Dilip said. "I had suspected for some time," Torrance intoned, then scowled as someone knocked on the door. "Come!" he shouted. "If you must." Sharpe opened the door and was immediately entangled in the muslin. He fought his way past its folds. "It's you," Torrance said unpleasantly. "Me, sir." "You let some moths in," Torrance complained. "Sorry, sir." That is why the muslin is there, Sharpe, to keep out moths, ensigns, and other insignificant nuisances. Kill the moths, Dilip." The clerk dutifully chased the moths about the room, swatting them with a roll of paper. The windows, like the door, were closely screened with muslin, on the outside of which moths clustered, attracted by the candles that were set in silver sticks on Torrance's table. Dilip's work was spread on the table, while Captain Torrance lay in a wide hammock slung from the roof beams. He was naked. "Do I offend you, Sharpe?" "Offend me, sir?" "I am naked. Or had you not noticed?" "Doesn't bother me, sir. Nudity keeps clothes clean. You should try it. Is the last of the enemy dead, Dilip?" "The moths are all deceased, Sahib." "Then we shall continue. Where were we?" "I had suspected for some time—" Dilip read back the report. "Surmised is better, I think. I had surmised for some time." Torrance paused to draw on the mouthpiece of a silver-bellied hookah. "What are you doing here, Sharpe?" "Come to get orders, sir." "How very assiduous of you." "I had surmised for some time that depredations, I can spell it if you cannot, Dilip, were being made upon the stores entrusted to my command." "What the devil were you doing, Sharpe, poking about in eggs' tents?" "Just happened to be passing them, sir," Sharpe said, "when they caught fire." Torrance gazed at Sharpe, plainly not believing a word. He shook his head sadly. "You look very old to be an ensign, Sharpe." "I was a sergeant 2 months ago, sir." Torrance adopted a look of pretended horror. "Oh, good God," he said archly. "Good God alive! May all the spavined saints preserve us! You're not telling me you've been made up from the ranks?" "Yes, sir." "Sweet suffering Jesus," Torrance said. He lay his head back on the hammock's pillow and blew a perfect smoke ring that he watched wobble its way up towards the ceiling. "Having confidential information as to the identity of the thief, I took steps to apprehend him." You will notice, Sharpe, that I am giving you no credit in this report." "No, sir." "Indeed I am not. This report will go to Colonel Butters, an appallingly bombastic creature who will, I suspect, attempt to take some of the credit for himself before passing the papers on to Arthur Wellesley, who, as you may know, is our commander. A very stern man, our Arthur. He likes things done properly. He plainly had a very stern governess in his nursery." "I know the General, sir." "You do?" Torrance turned his head to look at Sharpe. "Socially, perhaps. You and he dine together, do you? Pass the time of day, do you? Hunt together, maybe? Drink port? Talk about old times? Whore together, perhaps?" Torrance was mocking, but there was just an edge of interest in his voice, in case Sharpe really did know Sir Arthur. "I mean, I've met him, sir." Torrance shook his head as though Sharpe had been wasting his time. "Do stop calling me sir. It may be your natural subservience, Sharpe, or more likely it's the natural air of superiority that emanates from my person, but it ill becomes an officer, even one dredged up from the ranks. A search of his tents, Dilip, secured the missing items. I then, in accordance with general orders, hanged the thief as an example. I have the honour to be, etc., etc." 2,000 muskets are still missing, sir," Sharpe said. "Sorry, sir, I didn't mean to call you sir." "If it pleases you to grovel, Sharpe, then do so. 2,000 muskets still missing, eh? I suspect the bugger sold them on, don't you?" "I'm more interested in how he got them in the first place," Sharpe said. "How very tedious of you," Torrance said lightly. "I'd suggest talking to Sergeant Hakeswell when he gets back," Sharpe said. "I won't hear a word spoken against Obadiah," Torrance said. "Obadiah is a most amusing fellow." "He's a lying, thieving bastard," Sharpe said vehemently. "Sharpe, please!" Torrance's voice was pained. "How can you say such wicked things? You don't even know the fellow." "Oh, I know him, sir. I served under him in the Havercakes." "You did?" Torrance smiled. "I see we're in for interesting times. Perhaps I should keep the two of you apart. Or perhaps not. Brick!" The last word was shouted towards a door that led to the back of the commandeered house. The door opened, and the black-haired woman slipped past the muslin. "Sin?" she asked. She blushed when she saw Torrance was naked, and Torrance Sharpe saw enjoyed her embarrassment. "Brick, my dear," Torrance said, "my hooker has extinguished itself. Will you tend to it? Dillip's busy, or I would have asked him. Oh, Sharpe, may I have the honour of naming you to Brick? Brick, this is Ensign Sharpe. Ensign Sharpe, this is Brick." "Pleased to meet you, sir," the woman said, dropping a brief curtsy before she stooped to the hooker. She had clearly not told Torrance that she'd met Sharpe earlier. "Ma'am," Sharpe said. "Ma'am," Torrance said with a laugh. "She's called Brick, Sharpe." "Brick, sir?" Sharpe asked sourly. The name was utterly unsuited to the delicate-featured woman who now deftly disassembled the hooker. "Well, her real name is Mrs. Wall," Torrance explained. "And she's my laundress, seamstress, and conscience. Is that not right, little Brick?" "If you say so, sir." "I cannot abide dirty clothes," Torrance said. "They're an abomination unto the Lord. Cleanliness, we are constantly told by tedious folk, is next to godliness, but I suspect it's a superior virtue. Any peasant can be godly, but it is a rare person who is clean. Brick, however, keeps me clean. If you pay her a trifle, Sharpe, she'll doubtless wash and mend those rags you're pleased to call a uniform." "They've all I've got, sir." "So? Walk naked until Brick has serviced you. Or does the idea embarrass you?" "I wash my own clothes, sir." "I wish you would," Torrance said tartly. "Remind me why you came here, Sharpe." "Orders, sir." "Very well," Torrance said. "At dawn you will go to Colonel Butter's quarters and find an aide who can tell you what is required of us. You then tell Dillip. Dillip then arranges everything. After that you may take your rest. I trust you will not find these duties onerous?" Sharpe wondered why Torrance had asked for a deputy if the clerk did all the work, then supposed that the captain was so lazy that he couldn't be bothered to get up early in the morning to fetch his orders. "I get tomorrow's orders at dawn, sir," Sharpe said, "from an aide of Colonel Butter's." "There!" Torrance said with mock amazement. "You've mastered your duties, Ensign. I congratulate you." "We already have tomorrow's orders, Sahib," Dillip said from the table where he was copying a list of the recovered stores into Torrance's report. "We are to move everything to Deogom. The pioneers' stores are to be moved first, Sahib. The colonel's orders are on the table, Sahib, with the chitties. Pioneers' stores first, then everything else." "Well, I never," Torrance said. "See, your first day's work is done, Sharpe." He drew on the hooker which the woman had relit. "Excellent, my dear," he said, then held out a hand to stop her from leaving. She crouched beside the hammock, averting her eyes from Torrance's naked body. Sharpe sensed her unhappiness, and Torrance sensed Sharpe's interest in her. "Brick is a widow, Sharpe," he said, "and presumably looking for a husband, though I doubt she's ever dared to dream of marrying as high as an ensign, but why not? The social ladder is there to be climbed, and lower rung as you might be, Sharpe, you still represent a considerable advancement for Brick. Before she joined my service she was a mop-squeezer. From mop-squeezer to an officer's wife. There's progress for you. I think the two of you would suit each other vastly well. I shall play Cupid, or rather Dillip will. Take a letter to the chaplain of the 94th, Dillip. He's really sober, but I'm sure he can waddle through the marriage ceremony without falling over." "I can't marry, sir," Sharpe protested. Torrance, amused at himself, raised an eyebrow. "Well, you're averse to women? You dislike dear Brick? Or you've taken an oath of celibacy, perhaps?" Sharpe blushed. "I'm spoken for, sir." "You mean you're engaged? How very touching. Is she an heiress, perhaps?" Sharpe shrugged. "She's in Seringapatam," he said lamely. "Then we're not engaged." "But you have an understanding," Torrance said, "with this ravishing creature in Seringapatam. Is she black, Sharpe? A black BB? I'm sure Claire wouldn't mind, would you? A white man in India needs a BB or two as well as a wife. Don't you agree, Brick?" He turned to the woman who ignored him. "The late Mr. Wall died of the fever," Torrance said to Sharpe, "and in the Christian kindness of my heart I continue to employ his widow. Does that not speak well of my character?" "If you say so, sir." "I see my attempt to play Cupid is not meeting with success," Torrance said. "So, Sharpe, to business. Tomorrow morning I suggest you go to Deogorm, wherever the hell that is." "With a bullock, sir?" Torrance raised his eyebrows in exasperation. "You're an officer, Sharpe, not a bullock driver. You don't prod rumps. You leave that to the natives. Go early, ride there at dawn, and your first duty will be to find me quarters." "I don't have a horse," Sharpe said. "You don't have a horse! Don't have a horse! Good God alive, man, what bloody use are you? You'll just have to bloody well walk, then. I shall find you in Deogorm tomorrow afternoon, and God help you if you haven't found me decent quarters. A front room, Sharpe, where Dillip can conduct business, a large room for me, and a hole for Brick. I would also like to have a wall garden with adequate shade trees and a small pool." "Where is Deogorm?" Sharpe asked. "Northward, Sahib," Dillip answered. "Close to the hills." "Beneath Gavalga?" Sharpe guessed. "Yes, Sahib." Sharpe looked back to Torrance. "Can I ask a favour of you, sir?" Torrance sighed. "If you insist. At Gavalga, sir, I'd like permission to join the assault party." Torrance stared at Sharpe for a long time. "You want what?" he finally asked. "I want to be with the attack, sir. There's a fellow inside, see, who killed a friend of mine. I want to see him dead." Torrance blinked at Sharpe. "Don't tell me you're enthusiastic. Good God!" A sudden look of terror came to the captain's face. "You're not a Methodist, are you?" "No, sir." Torrance pointed the hooker's mouthpiece towards a corner of the room. "There is a linen press, Sharpe. Do you see it? Inside it are my clothes. Amidst my clothes you will find a pistol. Take the pistol, remove yourself from my presence, apply the muzzle to your head, and pull the trigger. It's a much quicker and less painful way of dying." "But you won't mind if I join the attack?" "Mind? Well, you're not surely labouring under the misapprehension that I care about your existence. You think I might mourn you, even after such a short acquaintance? My dear Sharpe, I fear I shall not miss you at all. I doubt I'll even remember your name once you're dead. Of course you can join the assaulting party. Do what you like. Now I suggest you get some sleep. Not here, though. I like my privacy. Find a tree, perhaps, and slumber beneath its sheltering branches. Good night to you, Sharpe." "Good night, sir." "And don't let any moths in." Sharpe negotiated the muslin and slipped out of the door. Torrance listened to the footsteps go away, then sighed. "A tedious man, Dillip." "Yes, Sahib." "I wonder why he was made an officer." Torrance frowned as he sucked on his hooker, then shook his head. "Poor Naig, sacrificed to a mere ensign's ambition. How did that wretched Sharpe even know to look in Naig's tent? Did he talk to you?" "Yes, Sahib," Dillip admitted. Torrance stared at him. "Did you let him look at the ledgers?" "He insisted, Sahib." "You're a bloody fool, Dillip. Bloody fool. I could thrash you if I wasn't so tired. Well, maybe tomorrow." "No, Sahib, please. Oh, just bugger away off, Dillip," Torrance snarled. "And you can go too, Brick." The girl fled to the kitchen door. Dillip collected his ink bottle and sand sprinkler. "Shall I take the chitties now, Sahib, for the morning?" "Go!" Torrance roared. "You bore me! Go!" Dillip fled to the front room, and Torrance lay back in the hammock. He was indeed bored. He had nothing to do and nowhere to go. Most nights he would go to Naig's tents, and there drink, gamble, and whore, but he could hardly visit the Green Pavilion this night, not after stringing Naig up by the neck. Damn it, he thought. He glanced at the table where a book, a gift from his father, lay unopened. The first volume of Some Reflections on Paul's Epistle to the Ephesians, by the Reverend Courtney Malison. And it would be a frigid day in the devil's house before Torrance read that turgid tome. The Reverend Malison had been Torrance's childhood tutor, and a vicious beast he had been. A whipper, that was Malison, loved to whip his pupils. Torrance stared at the ceiling. Money. It was all down to money. Everything in the damn world was down to money. Make money, he thought, and he could go home and make Courtney Malison's life a misery. Have the bastard on his knees, and Malison's daughter, have that prim bitch on her back. There was a knock on the door. "I said I didn't want to be disturbed," Torrance shouted, but despite his protest the door opened and the muslin billowed inward, letting in a flutter of moths. "For Christ's sake!" Torrance cursed, then fell abruptly silent. He fell silent, for the first man through the door was a jetty, his bare torso gleaming with oil, and behind him came the tall man with a limp, the same man who had pleaded for Naig's life. His name was Jama, and he was Naig's brother, and his presence made Torrance acutely aware of his nudity. He swung off the hammock and reached for his dressing-gown, but Jama twitched the silk garment off the chair back. "Captain Torrance," he said with a bow. "Who let you in?"
Torrance demanded. "I expect to see you in our small establishment tonight, Captain,"
Jama said. Where his brother had been plump, noisy, and a braggart, Jama was lean, silent, and watchful. Torrance shrugged. "Well, maybe tomorrow night."
"You will be welcome, Captain, as always."
Jama took a small sheaf of papers from his pocket and fanned his face with them.
10,000 welcomes, Captain."
10,000 rupees. That was the value of the papers in Jama's hand, all of them notes signed by Torrance. He'd signed far more, but the others he'd paid off with supplies filched from the convoys. Jama was here to remind Torrance that his greatest debts remained unpaid. "About today," Torrance said awkwardly.
"Ah, yes,"
Jama said, as though he had momentarily forgotten the reason for his visit.
"About today, Captain. Do tell me about today."
The jetty said nothing, just leant against the wall with folded arms, his oiled muscles shining in the candlelight, and his dark eyes fixed immovably on Torrance. "I've already told you, it wasn't of my doing," Torrance said with as much dignity as a naked man could muster.
"You're the one who demanded my brother's death,"
Jama said. "But what choice did I have once the supplies were found?"
"But perhaps you arranged for them to be found."
"No!" Torrance protested. "Why the hell would I do that?" Jama was silent a moment, then indicated the huge man at his side.
"His name is Prithviraj. I once saw him castrate a man with his bare hands."
Jama mimed a pulling action, smiling.
"You'd be astonished at how far a little skin can stretch before it breaks."
"For God's sake!" Torrance had gone pale. "It wasn't my doing."
"Then whose doing was it?"
"His name is Sharpe. Ensign Sharpe." Jama walked to Torrance's table, where he turned the pages of Some Reflections on Paul's Epistle to the Ephesians.
"This Sharpe," he asked, "he was not obeying your orders?"
"Of course not." Jama shrugged.
"My brother was careless," he admitted, "overconfident. He believed that with your friendship he could survive any inquiry."
"But we were doing business," Torrance said. "It was not friendship. And I told your brother he should have hidden the supplies."
"Yes," Jama said, "he should. And so I told him also, but even so, Captain, I come from a proud family. You expect me to watch my brother killed and do nothing about it?"
He fanned out the notes of Torrance's debts.
"I shall return these to you, Captain, when you deliver Ensign Sharpe to me, alive. I want Prithviraj to take my revenge. You understand?"
Torrance understood well enough. "Sharpe's a British officer," he said. "If he's murdered, there'll be an inquiry. A real inquiry. Heads will be broken."
"That is your problem, Captain Torrance," Jama said. "How you explain his disappearance is your affair, as are your debts."
He smiled and pushed the notes back into the pouch at his belt.
"Give me Sharpe, Captain Torrance, or I shall send Prithviraj to visit you in the night. In the meantime, you will please continue to patronize our establishment."
"Bastard," Torrance said. But Jama and his huge companion had already gone. Torrance picked up Some Reflections on Paul's Epistle to the Ephesians and slammed the heavy book down on a moth. "Bastard," he said again. But on the other hand, it was Sharpe who would suffer, not him, so it didn't really matter. And what was Sharpe anyway? Nothing but an upstart from the ranks, so who would care if he died? Torrance killed another moth, then opened the kitchen door. "Come here, Brick." "No, sir, please. Shut up and come here. You can kill these damn moths while I get drunk." Filthy drunk, he reckoned, for he'd been scared today. He knew he'd very nearly got caught when Sharpe had stripped the tent away from the purloined supplies, but by killing Nade quickly, Torrance had protected himself. And now the price of his continued survival was Sharpe's death. Arrange that, he thought, and all his troubles would be past. He forced Brick to drink some arrack, knowing how she hated it. Then he drank some himself. Damn Sharpe to hell, he thought. Damn the interfering bastard to hell. Which was where Sharpe was going anyway. So Torrance drank to that happy prospect. Farewell, Mr. Sharpe. Chapter 4. Sharpe wasn't sure how far Deargorm was, but but guessed it was close to 20 miles, at least a 7-hour journey on foot. And so it was long before dawn when he stirred Ahmed from his sleep beside the smouldering remains of a bullock-dung fire, then set off under the stars. He tried to teach Ahmed some English. "Stars," Sharpe said, pointing. "Stars," Ahmed repeated dutifully. "Moon," Sharpe said. "Moon," Ahmed echoed. "Sky." "Moon?" Ahmed asked, curious that Sharpe was still pointing to the sky. "Sky, you bugger." "Sky, you bugger." "Never mind," Sharpe said. He was hungry, and he'd forgotten to ask Captain Torrance where he was supposed to draw rations, but their northward route took them through the village of Argaum, where the fighting battalions of the army were bivouacked. Unburied bodies still littered the battlefield, and scavenging wild dogs growled from the dark stench as Sharpe and Ahmed walked past. A picket challenged them at the village, and Sharpe asked the man where he'd find the cavalry lines. He couldn't imagine taking Ahmed to the 74th mess for breakfast, but Sergeant Eli Lockhart might be more welcoming. The reveille had sounded by the time Sharpe came to the gully where the horses were picketed, and the troopers' campfires were being restored to life. Lockhart scowled at the unexpected visitor through the smoky dawn gloom, then grinned when he recognized Sharpe. "Must be some fighting to do, lads," he announced. "The bleeding infantry's here. Good morning, sir. Need our help again?" "I need some breakfast," Sharpe admitted. "Tea, that'll start you off. Smithers, pork chops. Davis, some of that bread you're hiding from me. Look lively now." Lockhart turned back to Sharpe. "Don't ask me where the chops come from, sir. I might have to lie." He spat in a tin mug, scoured its interior with the end of his blanket, then filled it with tea. "There you are, sir. Does your boy want some? Here you are, lad." Lockhart, a mug of tea in his own hand, then insisted on taking Sharpe to the picketed horses. "See, sir?" He lifted a horse's leg to show off the new horseshoe. "My governor's beholden to you. I might introduce you after breakfast." Sharpe assumed that Lockhart was talking of his troop commander, but once the pork chops and bread had been eaten, the sergeant led Sharpe across to the lines of the native cavalry, and then to the tent of the 7th Native Cavalry's commanding officer, who it seemed was in charge of all the army's cavalry. "He's called Huddleston," Lockhart said, "and he's a decent fellow. He'll probably offer us another breakfast." Colonel Huddleston did indeed insist that both Lockhart and Sharpe join him for a breakfast of rice and eggs. Sharpe was beginning to see that Lockhart was a useful man, someone who was trusted by his officers and liked by his troopers, for Huddleston greeted the sergeant warmly and immediately plunged into a conversation about some local horses that had been purchased for remounts, and which Huddleston reckoned would never stand the strain of battle, though Lockhart seemed to feel that a few of them would be adequate. "So, you're the fellow who smoked out an egg," Huddleston said to Sharpe after a while. "It didn't take much doing, sir." "Well, no one else did it, man. Don't shy away from the credit. I'm damn grateful to you." "I could have done it without Sergeant Lockhart, sir." "Damned army would come to a stop without Eli, ain't that so?" the colonel said, and Lockhart, his mouth full of egg, just grinned. Huddleston turned back to Sharpe. "So they gave you to Torrance?" "Yes, sir." "He's a lazy bugger," Huddleston said vengefully. Sharpe, astonished at the open criticism, said nothing. "He's one of my own officers," Huddleston went on, "and I confess I wasn't sorry when he asked to be given duty with a bullock train." "He asked, sir?" Sharpe found it curious that a man would prefer to be with a baggage when he could be in a fighting unit. "Well, his uncle is grooming him for a career in the company," Huddleston said. "An uncle in Leadenhall Street. Know what Leadenhall Street is, Sharpe?" "The company officer, sir." "The very same. The uncle pays him an allowance, and he wants Torrance to get some experience in dealing with Binjaris. Got it all planned out. A few years in the company's army, another few trading in spices, then home to inherit his uncle's estate and his seat in the court of directors. One day we'll all be tugging our forelocks to the lazy bugger. Still, if he wants to run the baggage train, it's no skin off our bums, Sharpe. No one likes a job, so Torrance is welcome to it. But my guess is that you'll be doing most of his work." The colonel frowned. "He arrived in India with 3 English servants. Can you believe it? It ain't as if servants are hard to find here, but Torrance wanted the cachet of white scullions. 2 of them died of the fever. Then Torrance had the nerve to say that one of them hadn't earned the cost of the voyage out, and so he's forcing the widow to stay on and pay the debt." Huddleston shook his head, then gestured for his servant to pour more tea. "So what brings you here, Ensign?" "On my way to Diogom, sir." "He really came to beg his breakfast, Colonel," Lockhart put in.
"And I've no doubt the sergeant fed you before you came to steal my victuals?" Huddleston asked, then grinned. "You're in luck, Ensign. We're moving up to Dergorm today. You can ride with us." Sharpe blushed. "But I've no horse, sir." "Eli?" Huddleston looked at Lockhart. "I've got a horse you can ride, sir." "Good." Huddleston blew on his tea. "Welcome to the cavalry, Sharpe." Lockhart found 2 horses, one for Sharpe and the other for Ahmed. Sharpe, ever uncomfortable on horseback, struggled into the saddle under the cavalry's sardonic gaze, while Ahmed jumped up and kicked back his heels, revelling in being back on a horse. They went gently northwards, taking care not to tire the horses. Sharpe, as he rode, found himself thinking about Claire Wall, and that made him feel guilty about Simone Joubert, the young French widow who waited for him in Seringapatam. He had sent her there with a southbound convoy and a letter for his friend Major Stokes, and doubtless Simone was waiting for Sharpe to return when the campaign against the Marathas was over. But now he needed to warn her that he was being posted back to England. Would she come with him? Did he want her to come? He wasn't sure about either question, though he felt obscurely responsible for Simone. He could give her a choice, of course, but whenever Simone was faced by a choice, she tended to look limp and wait for someone else to make the decision. He had to warn her, though. Would she even want to go to England? But what else could she do? She had no relatives in India, and the nearest French settlements were miles away. His thoughts were interrupted at mid-morning when Eli Lockhart spurred alongside his horse. "See it?" "See what?" "Up there." Lockhart pointed ahead, and Sharpe, peering through the dust haze thrown up by the leading squadrons, saw a range of high hills. The lower slopes were green with trees, but above the timberline there was nothing but brown and grey cliffs that stretched from horizon to horizon. And at the very top of the topmost bluff he could just see a streak of dark wall broken by a gate tower. "Gavalgur," Lockhart said. "How the hell do we attack up there?" Sharpe asked. The sergeant laughed. "We don't. It's a job for the infantry. Reckon you're better off attached to that fellow Torrance." Sharpe shook his head. "I have to get in there, Eli." "Why?" Sharpe gazed at the distant wall. "There's a fellow called Dodd in there, and the bastard killed a friend of mine." Lockhart thought for a second. 700 guineas, Dodd." "That's the fellow," Sharpe said. "But I'm not after the reward. I just want to see the bugger dead." "Me too," Lockhart said grimly. "You?" "Esaye," Lockhart said brusquely. "Well, what happened?" "We charged his troops. They were knocking 7 kinds of hell out of the 74th, and we caught the buggers in line. Knocked him hard back, but we must have had a dozen troopers unhorsed. We didn't stop, though. We just kept after their cavalry, and it wasn't till the battle was over that we found our lads. They had their throats cut. All of them." "That sounds like Dodd," Sharpe said. The renegade Englishman liked to spread terror. "Make a man afraid," Dodd had once told Sharpe, "and he won't fight you so hard." "So maybe I'll go into Gavalgur with you," Lockhart said. "Cavalry?" Sharpe asked. "They won't let cavalry into a real fight." Lockhart grinned. "I couldn't let an ensign go into a fight without help. Poor little bugger might get hurt." Sharpe laughed. The cavalry had swerved off the road to pass a long column of marching infantry who had set off before dawn on their march to Dergorm. The leading regiment was Sharpe's own, the 74th, and Sharpe moved even further away from the road so that he wouldn't have to acknowledge the men who'd wanted to be rid of him. But Ensign Venables spotted him, leapt the roadside ditch and ran to his side. "Going up in the world, Richard?" Venables asked. "Borrowed glory," Sharpe said. "The horse belongs to the 19th. Venables looked slightly relieved that Sharpe hadn't suddenly been able to afford a horse. "Are you with the pioneers now?" he asked. "Nothing so grand," Sharpe said, reluctant to admit that he'd been reduced to being a bullet guard. Venables didn't really care. "Because that's what we're doing," he explained, "escorting the pioneers. It seems to have to make a road." "Up there," Sharpe guessed, nodding towards the fortress that dominated the plain. "Captain Urquhart says you might be selling your commission," Venables said. "Does he? Are you? Are you making an offer?" "I've got a brother, you see," Venables explained. "3, actually, and some sisters. My father might buy." He took a piece of paper from a pocket and handed it up to Sharpe. "So if you go home, why not see my pater? That's his address. He reckons one of my brothers should join the army. Ain't any good for anything else, see?
I'll think on it, Sharpe said, taking the paper. The cavalry had stretched ahead, and so he clapped his heels back and the horse jerked forward, throwing Sharpe back in the saddle. For a second he sprawled, almost falling over the beast's rump. Then he flailed wildly to catch his balance and just managed to grasp the saddle pommel. He thought he heard laughter as he trotted away from the battalion. Gavelgur soared above the plain like a threat, and Sharpe felt like a poacher with nowhere to hide. From up there, Sharpe reckoned, the approaching British army would look like so many ants in the dust. He wished he had a telescope to stare at the high distant fortress, but he'd been reluctant to spend money. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't that he was poor. Indeed, there were few soldiers richer. Yet he feared that the real reason was that he felt fraudulent wearing an officer's sash, and that if he were to buy the usual appurtenances of an officer, a horse and a telescope and an expensive sword, then he'd be mocked by those in the army who claimed he should never have been commissioned in the first place. Nor should he thought. He'd been happier as a sergeant, much happier. All the same, he wished he had a telescope, as he gazed up at the stronghold and saw a great billow of smoke jet from one of the bastions. Seconds later he heard the fading boom of the gun, but he saw no sign of the shot falling. It was as though the cannonball had been swallowed into the warm air. A mile short of the foothills the road split into three. The sepoy horsemen went westwards, while the 19th Light Dragoons took the right-hand path that angled away from the domineering fortress. The country became more broken as it was cut by small gullies and heaped with low wooded ridges, the first hints of the tumultuous surge of land that ended in the vast cliffs. Trees grew thick in those foothills, and Deargorm was evidently among the low-wooded hills. It lay east of Gavelgur, safely out of range of the fortress's guns. A crackle of musketry sounded from a timbered cleft, and the 19th Dragoons, riding ahead of Sharpe, spread into a line. Ahmed grinned and made sure his musket was loaded. Sharpe wondered which side the boy was on. Another spatter of muskets sounded, this time to the west. The Marathas must have had men in the foothills. Perhaps they were stripping the villagers of the stored grain. The sepoys of the East India Company cavalry had vanished, while the horsemen of the 19th were filing into the wooded cleft. A gun boomed in the fort, and this time Sharpe heard a thump as a cannonball fell to earth like a stone far behind him. A patch of dust drifted from a field where the shot had plummeted. Then he and Ahmed followed the dragoons into the gully, and the leaves hid them from the invisible watchers high above. The road twisted left and right, then emerged into a patchwork of small fields and woods. Deargorm. Then there were shots to his left, and he saw a crowd of horsemen burst out of the trees a half-mile away. They were Marathas, and at first Sharpe thought they were intent on charging the 19th Light Dragoons. Then he realized they were fleeing from the company cavalry. There were 50 or 60 of the enemy horsemen, who, on seeing the blue and yellow-coated dragoons, swerved southwards to avoid a fight. The dragoons were turning, drawing sabres and spurring into pursuit. A trumpet sounded, and the small fields were suddenly a whirl of horses, dust, and gleaming weapons. Sharpe reined in among a patch of trees, not wanting to be at the centre of a Maratha cavalry charge. The enemy horse pounded past in a blur of hooves, shining helmets and lance points. The company cavalry was still a quarter-mile behind when Ahmed suddenly kicked back his heels and shot out of the hiding-place to follow the Maratha cavalry. Sharpe swore. The little bastard was running back to join the Marathas. Not that Sharpe could blame him, but he still felt disappointed. He knew he had no chance of catching Ahmed, who had unslung his musket and now rode up behind the rearmost enemy horseman. That man looked round, saw Ahmed was not in British uniform, and so ignored him. Ahmed galloped alongside, then swung his musket by its barrel so that the heavy stock cracked into the Maratha's forehead. The man went off the back of his horse as though jerked by a rope. His horse ran on, stirrups flapping. Ahmed reined in, turned, and jumped down beside his victim. Sharpe saw the flash of a knife. The sepoy cavalry was closer now, and they might think Ahmed was the enemy. So Sharpe shouted at the boy to come back. Ahmed scrambled back into his saddle and kicked his horse to the trees where Sharpe waited. He'd plundered a sabre, a pistol, and a leather bag, and had a grin as wide as his face. The bag held 2 stale loaves of flat bread, some glass beads, and a small book in a strange script. Ahmed gave 1 loaf to Sharpe, threw away the book, draped the cheap beads about his neck, and hung the sabre at his waist. then watched as the dragoons cut into the rearward ranks of the fugitives. There was the blacksmith's sound of steel on steel. 2 horses stumbled in flurries of dust. A man staggered, bleeding, into a ditch. Pistols banged. A lance shivered, point downwards, in the dry turf, and then the enemy horse was gone, and the British and sepoy cavalry reined in. "Why can't you be a proper servant?" Sharpe asked Ahmed. "Clean my boots, wash my clothes, make my supper, eh?" Ahmed, who didn't understand a word, just grinned. "Instead I get some murderous urchin. So come on, you bugger." Sharpe kicked his horse towards the village. He passed a half-empty tank where some clothes lay to dry on bushes. Then he was in the dusty main street, which appeared to be deserted, though he was aware of faces watching nervously from dark windows and curtain-hung doorways. Dogs growled from the shade, and 2 chickens scratched in the dust. The only person in sight was a naked holy man who sat cross-legged under a tree, with his long hair cascading to the ground about him. He ignored Sharpe, and Sharpe ignored him. "We have to find a house," Sharpe told the uncomprehending Ahmed. "House, see? House." The village headman, the Nake, ventured into the street. That is, Sharpe assumed he was the Nake, just as the Nake assumed that the mounted soldier was the leader of the newly arrived cavalrymen. He clasped his hands before his face and bowed to Sharpe, then clicked his fingers to summon a servant carrying a small brass tray on which stood a little cup of arrack. The fierce liquor made Sharpe's head feel suddenly light. The Nake was talking 10 to the dozen, but Sharpe quietened him with a wave. "No good talking to me," he said. "I'm nobody. Talk to him." He pointed to Colonel Huddleston, who was leading his Indian cavalrymen into the village. The troopers dismounted as Huddleston talked to the headman. There was a squawk as the 2 chickens were snatched up. Huddleston turned to the sound, but his men all looked innocent. High above Sharpe a gun banged in the fortress. The shot seared out, to fall somewhere in the plain where the British infantry marched. The dragoons came into the village, some with bloodied sabres, and Sharpe surrendered the 2 horses to Lockhart. Then he searched the street to find a house for Torrance. He saw nothing which had a walled garden, but he did find a small mud-walled home that had a courtyard, and he dropped his pack in the main room as a sign of ownership. There was a woman with 2 small children who shrank away from him. "It's all right," Sharpe said. "You get paid. No one will hurt you." The woman wailed and crouched as though expecting to be hit. "Bloody hell," Sharpe said. "Does no one in this bleeding country speak English?" He had nothing to do now until Torrance arrived. He could have hunted through the village to discover paper, a pen and ink, so he could write to Simone and tell her about going to England. He decided that chore could wait. He stripped off his belt, sabre and jacket, found a rope bed, and lay down. Far overhead the fortress guns fired. It sounded like distant thunder. Sharpe slept. Sergeant Obadiah Hakeswill tugged off his boots, releasing a stench into the room that caused Captain Torrance to close his eyes. "Good God," Torrance said weakly. The captain felt ill enough already. He had drunk the best part of a bottle of arrack, had woken in the night with gripes in the belly, and then slept unevenly until dawn, when someone had scratched at his door, and Torrance had shouted at the pest to go away, after which it had last fallen into a deeper sleep. Now he'd been woken by Hakeswill, who, oblivious of the stench, began to unwrap the cloths that bound his feet. It smelt, Torrance thought, like rotted cheese that had been stored in a corpse's belly. He shifted his chair slightly towards the window and pulled his dressing-gown tighter about his chest. "I'm truly sorry about Naig," Torrance said. Hakeswill had listened in disbelief to the tale of Naig's death, and seemed genuinely saddened by it, just as he had been shocked by the news that Sharpe was now Torrance's assistant. "The bleeding Scotch didn't want him, sir, did they?" Hakeswill said. "Never thought the Scotch had much sense, but they had wits enough to get rid of Sharpe." Hakeswill had uncovered his right foot, and Torrance, barely able to endure the stink, suspected there was black fungus growing between the sergeant's toes. "Now you've got him, sir," Hakeswill went on, "and I pities you, I does. Decent officer like you, sir. Last thing you deserved, bleeding Sharpe. He ain't got no right to be an officer, sir, not Sharpe. He ain't a gentleman like your good self, sir. He's just a common toad like the rest of us." "So why was he commissioned?" Torrance asked, watching as Hakeswill tugged at the crusted cloth on his left foot.
On account of saving the General's life, sir. Leastwise, that's what it's said.
Hexwell paused as a spasm made his face twitch.
Saved Sir Arthur's life at Assaye. Not that I believe it, sir, but Sir Arthur does, and the result of that, sir, is that Sir Arthur thinks bloody Sharpe is a blue-eyed boy. Sharpe farts, and Sir Arthur thinks the wind's turned southerly.
Does he now? Torrance asked. That was worth knowing.
4 years ago, sir, Hexwell said, I had Sharpe flogged. Would have been a dead 'un too, sir, he would, like he deserved. Only Sir Arthur stopped the flogging after 200 lashes. Stopped it!
The injustice of the act still galled the sergeant.
Now he's a bleeding officer. I tells you, sir, the army ain't what it was. Gone to the dogs, it has.
He pulled the cloth from his left foot, then frowned at his toes.
I washed them in August, he said in wonderment. But it don't look like it, does it?
It is now December, Sergeant, Torrance said reprovingly.
A good sluice should last 6 months, sir.
Some of us engage in a more regular toilet, Torrance hinted.
Well, you would, sir, being a gentleman. Thing is, sir, I wouldn't normally take the toe rags off, only there's a blister.
Hexwell frowned.
Haven't had a blister in years. Poor Naig. For a blackamoor, he wasn't a bad sort of fellow.
Naig, Torrance believed, had been as evil a creature as any on the surface of the earth, but he smiled piously at Hexwell's tribute. We shall certainly miss him, Sergeant.
Pity you had to hang him, sir. But what choice did you have? Between a devil and a deep blue buggeration, that's where you were, sir. But poor Naig.
Hexwell shook his head in sad remembrance.
You should have strung up Sharpe, sir. More's a pity you couldn't. Strung him up proper, like what he deserves. A murdering bastard he is, murdering!
And an indignant Hexwell told Captain Torrance how Sharpe had tried to kill him, first by throwing him among the Tippoo's tigers, then by trapping him in a courtyard with an elephant trained to kill by crushing men with its forefoot.
Only the tigers weren't hungry, see, on account of being fed. And as for the elephant, sir, I had me knife, didn't I? I jabbed it in the paw, I did.
He mimed the stabbing action.
Right in its paw, deep in. It didn't like it. I can't die, sir. I can't die.
The sergeant spoke hoarsely, believing every word. He'd been hanged as a child, but he'd survived the gallows, and now believed he was protected from death by his own guardian angel. Mad, Torrance thought, bedlam mad, but he was nevertheless fascinated by Obadiah Hexwell. To look at, the sergeant appeared the perfect soldier. It was the twitch that suggested something more interesting lay behind the bland blue eyes, and what lay behind those childish eyes, Torrance had decided, was a breathtaking malevolence, yet one that was accompanied by an equally astonishing confidence. Hexwell, Torrance had decided, would murder a baby and find justification for the act. "So you don't like Mr. Sharpe?" Torrance asked.
I hates him, sir, and I don't mind admitting it. I him I have, sliver his way up the ranks like a bleeding eel up a drain.
Hexwell had taken out a knife, presumably the one which he had stabbed into the elephant's foot, and now cocked his right heel on his left knee and laid the blade against the blister. Torrance shut his eyes to spare himself the sight of Hexwell performing surgery. "The thing is, Sergeant," he said, "that Naig's brother would rather like a private word with Mr. Sharpe."
"Does he now?"
Hexwell asked. He stabbed down.
"Look at that, sir. Proper bit of pus. Soon be healed. Ain't had a blister in years. Reckon it must be the new boots."
He spat on the blade and poked the blister again.
"I'll have to soak the boots in vinegar, sir." "So Jama wants Sharpe's ghoulies, does he?"
"Literally, as it happens, yes."
"He can join a bleeding queue."
"No," Torrance said sternly. "It's important to me, Sergeant, that Mr. Sharpe is delivered to Jama alive, and that his disappearance occasions no curiosity."
"You mean no one must notice?"
Hexwell's face twitched while he thought. Then he shrugged.
"Ain't difficult, sir."
"It isn't?"
"I'll have a word with Jama, sir. Then you can give Sharpe some orders, and I'll be waiting for him. It'll be easy, sir. Glad to do it for you."
"You are a comfort to me, Sergeant."
"That's my job, sir,"
Hexwell said, then leered at the kitchen door where Claire Wall had appeared.
"Sunshine of my life,"
he said in what he hoped was a winning tone. "Your tea, sir," Claire said, offering a cup. "Mug for the sergeant. Brick, where are your manners?"
"She don't need manners,"
Hexwell said, still leering at the terrified Claire.
"Not with what she's got." Put some sugar in it, darling, if the captain will spare me some.
Give him sugar, Brick, Torrance ordered. Hexwell watched Brick go back to the kitchen.
A proper little woman, that's a flower. That's what she is, a flower.
No doubt you would like to pluck her.
Well, it's time I was married, Hexwell said. A man should leave a son, sir. Says so in the scriptures.
You want to do some begetting, eh? Torrance said, then frowned as someone knocked on the outer door. Come, he called. An infantry captain whom neither man recognized put his head round the door. Captain Torrance. That's me, Torrance said grandly. Sir Arthur Wellesley's compliments, the captain said, his acid tone suggesting that the compliments would be remarkably thin. But is there any reason why the supplies have not moved northwards? Torrance stared at the man. For a second he was speechless, then he cursed under his breath. My compliments to the General, he said, and my assurances that the bullock train will be on its way immediately. He waited until the captain had gone, then swore again.
What happened, sir?
Hexwell asked. The bloody chitties, Torrance said. Still here. Didder must have come for them this morning, but I told him to bugger off. He swore again. Bloody Wellesley will pull my guts out backwards for this. Hexwell found the chitties on the table and went to the door, leaving small bloody marks on the floor from his open blister.
Dilly! Dilly! You black bastard heathen swine! Here, take these. On your way.
Damn! Torrance said, standing and pacing the small room. Damn, damn, damn!
Nothing to worry about, sir,
Hexwell said. Easy for you to say, Sergeant. Hexwell grinned as his face was distorted by twitches.
Just blame someone else, sir, he said, as is usually done in the army.
Who? Sharpe? You said yourself he's Wellesley's blue-eyed boy. I'm supposed to blame him, or you, perhaps? Hexwell tried to calm the captain down by giving him his cup of tea.
Blame Dilly, sir, on account of him being a heathen bastard as black as my new boots.
He'll simply deny everything when questioned, Torrance protested. Hexwell smiled.
Won't be in a position to deny anything, sir, will he? On account of being...
He paused, stuck his tongue out, opened his eyes wide, and made a choking noise. Good God, Sergeant, Torrance said, shuddering at the horrid picture suggested by Hexwell's contorted face. Besides, he's a good clerk. It's damned difficult to replace good men.
It's easy, sir. Jarmer will give us a man. Give us a good man.
Hexwell grinned.
It'll make things much easier, sir, if we can trust the clerk as well as each other.
Torrance flinched at the thought of being in league with Obadiah Hexwell, yet if he was ever to pay off his debts, he needed the sergeant's cooperation. And Hexwell was marvellously efficient. He could strip the supplies bare and not leave a trace of his handiwork, always making sure someone else took the blame.